Ladies and gentlemen, Coherlock, Choctadala, Shanadori, Coholori, on Agina looked fakina, Nairan, August Chimpna down. Coherlock, TD, senators, councillors, ladies and gentlemen, and our audience around the globe through live streaming. You're all very welcome here to Tubbercurry Library on this occasion when we commemorate the Connaught Rangers mutiny. My name is Donald Tinney. I'm the coordinator for the Decade of Centenary commemorations, and this is one of the major ones in our calendar of events. Throughout the last 5 years, we have half of it done. We have another 5 to go. This is one of our major ones. This year, we will have another one at the end of the year with Martin Savage commemoration. So we try to bring it out to the community. That's our brief, and the community here in Tubbercurry have come forward and with this proposal that we do this lead in for an unveiling of a plaque next year, because the actual centenary is 2020. So in order to get it out there about what the mutineers, who the mutineers were, and what was the history behind that, we decided we'd get the expert here to come and tell us, set the scene and tell us the story of what happened. So I'm delighted with the great turnout here in Tubbercurry on this occasion. And we have a few people to speak here today, and I just invite the Coherlock Councillor Tom McSharry to come up and open proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donal. Coherlock of the local municipal district, Councillor Paul Taylor, my fellow Councillor Martin Connolly, Deputies Martin McSharry and Eamon Scanlon. I have apologies from Eamon O'Queeve TD, apologies from Councillor Bree, Healy and Martin Baker, to our committee chair, Jerry Lundy, and members of your organising committee, our special guest historians, Dr. Ewan O'Halpine, Dr. Mario Draper, Dr. Danny Tiernan, President of the local Chamber of Commerce, Roger McCarrick, County Librarian Donald Tinney, and members of the library staff, distinguished guests and friends, and of course those of you that are watching in from on live stream from all over the world. As Coherlock, it is for me indeed a great honour to join you today for the official launch of the centenary programme of the Connaught Rangers Mutiny. For many people of a certain generation, the Connaught Rangers Mutiny was a footnote in our history, often referenced, but seldom explored or discussed in any great detail. The local committee, chaired by Jerry Lundy, assisted by the expertise of the local library staff, has served to address this deficit, and their original research and detailed preparations have opened up new insights on this era and this episode. I think the fact that the mutiny took place in India meant that it never fully resonated with the Irish public, but any consideration of the facts will show many similarities between our respective countries. India's struggle for independence can also be placed in an Irish and a wider international context, and 100 years on, we acknowledge the courage and integrity of the Irish men who were resolute in support of those who fought freedom and independence. The monument to be erected in the Wolfetone Square of Tubbercurry will be a cherished memorial dedicated to the memory of 3 men who took part in the mutiny: James Gorman from Tubbercurry, Martin Boy Conlon, and Jack Scanlon from Sligo Town. And we have Jack's great-grandnephew Brian Scanlon with us today. The proposed dedication date of the 28th of June 2020 will coincide with the centenary anniversary of the mutiny. Without the exemplary work of the local community and local library staff, this project would not have progressed, and I know you enjoyed the support and encouragement of all the local community. Our keen sense of history, our regard for the heroes of previous generations, our tradition of fully integrating in our adopted lands, all these factors combine to underpin and drive this project forward. I know you have a significant programme of work ahead of you leading up to June 2020, but given the calibre of the people involved and the considerable progress you have made to date, I have no doubt it will be an unqualified success. Garamagat.
Thanks, Coherlock. Just like to point a bit of housekeeping, which I should have done at the outset. There are 3 fire exits here, 2 on the left and 1 on the right, and I'd ask people to switch off their mobile phones as well, please, if you wouldn't mind. The next speaker is President and founder member of Tubbercurry Chamber of Commerce and Community Group. I'd like to ask Roger McCarry to come and say a few words as well. Thank you.
Reverend Fathers, Sisters, public representatives, specialist guest speakers, Connaught Ranger families, families of all World War I soldiers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roger McCarrick. I'm here as President of Tubbercurry Chamber of Commerce and Community Association. B'waithlum fáilte chur raibh gach aine an seo inniu go Tubbercurry. I wish to extend a very warm Tubbercurry welcome to each and every one of you here today. I also wish to welcome all of you who are watching here on live stream from different parts of Ireland and the world, and we're delighted to be able to go into your sitting rooms, offices, or wherever you wish to watch. We're gathering here today in Chatliney to acknowledge the Connaught Rangers mutiny in India, which happened in June of 1920. Now, we have a star lineup of speakers here for you, each of whom have done marvellous research on this topic, and a new light will be shone on a topic that was often overlooked by history. I, as a child growing up in Tubbercurry in the 1960s, always had an interest in social, political and military history, and once a teenager I became aware of the Connaught Rangers Regiment, its connection to Tubbercurry and to South Sligo, and a man from that regiment who lived in the town here, James Gorman. Like every town and parish in Ireland since the 1800s, young men left Tubbercurry and South Sligo to join the British Army. Some joined the Connaught Rangers in Boyle or Sligo, but many others joined other regiments in Ireland, England, America, and the Anzacs in Australia and New Zealand. South Sligo and Tubbercurry surnames like Allen, Boland, Brennan, Cunyan, Durkin, Gallagher, Mannion, Kennedy or Lundy, Maguire or McGuinn, Noon, Kilcoyne, Walsh or Walker. They were just some of the names of the surnames that served in regiments around the world, both in the Connaught Rangers and in other regiments like the Dublin Fusiliers, the Border Regiment, the Coldstream Regiment, the Royal Engineers, and the American Forces and the Anzacs of Australia and New Zealand. Many fought and died not alone in World War I, but also in the Boer War and in many other war theatres that the British Empire was involved in throughout the 19th and early 20th century. We are here today to acknowledge the Connaught Rangers mutiny in India of June 1920, with specific reference to Sligo men involved in that action, namely James Gorman, Tubbercurry, Martin Conlon and Jack Scanlon from Sligo town, and a fourth man that Tom didn't even know about when he mentioned that there was only three. There was a Patrick Dyer that we only tracked down yesterday evening, and his family delightfully are here today, Patrick Dyer from Drumnagranchi and Ballymote. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Tubbercurry of the 60s when James Gorman was a respected veteran of World War I and the Indian Mutiny. His granddaughter Mary Henry will speak to you shortly. We will also hear from Brian Scanlon here, who is a grandnephew of the mutineer Jack Scanlon and a family friend of the other man, mutineer Martin Conlon. And the fourth County Sligo mutineer, as I say, Patrick Dyer. We only tracked down his family yesterday evening, and we're delighted to have all the families of the four County Sligo mutineers represented here this afternoon. Now, I don't want to detain you too long, but as a Tubbercurry person here today, I do want to say a few words about our own Tubbercurry mutineer, James Gorman. James was born in 1896 to parents James Sr., and his mother was Annie McGuinn. James Sr. was also a Connaught Ranger who served in the Boer War at the turn of the century in South Africa, and later he re-enlisted to serve in the First World War. And our James Jr. we call him, his mother was also from a military family, the McGuinns, and some of her brothers were also in the army, so it was probably natural that our James Gorman, James Jr. we'll call him, would enlist in the Rangers like his father and uncles. Now, doing a bit of research there during the week, the 1911 census of Tubbercurry shows the Gorman family lived in house number 15 on Humbert Street, Tubbercurry. Now, Humbert Street is the street we're actually on here this afternoon. And would you believe that house number 15, where the Gorman family lived in 1911, was literally next door to this building here. The houses are since demolished and rebuilt, new houses built on the site. But in 1911, the Gorman family lived literally next door. And as well as that, the Gorman family lived on this street, as did about 40 other families at the time, giving a population of at least 200 to 250 people on this street alone. Now, at that time in the early 1900s, and even up to the 1960s when I was growing up, this street was generally known as Piper Hill. Now, Piper Hill was the original name of this street, and it was only renamed by officialdom in 1898 as part of the centenary celebrations of the 1798 rebellion. We have a lot of Humbert Streets, Wolfe Tone Squares, and all those names date back to 1798. Now, one might ask, why did this street get its name Piper Hill? And the answer is very simple and logical. There were so many military families living on this street throughout all the 1800s that when the soldiers returned here on leave from their military exertions across Europe, they brought home their bagpipes to keep in practice. Tubbercurry and South Sligo always had a great tradition of traditional music, with piping especially strong. Thus the name it acquired, Piper Hill. Archdeacon O'Rourke, in his History of County Sligo, written in the 1880s, refers at length to Piper Hill, Tubbercurry, with its associated combination of poverty, fun and music. One can only imagine Piper Hill, Tubbercurry of the time. Small, tightly packed houses, large families, pipers playing music in houses or on the streets, and soldiers on leave from the Connaught Rangers retelling stories of their adventures across Europe, Africa and the Middle East. It was probably a magic if you weren't hungry. As others will talk about the mutiny itself, I will just skip forward to the life in Tubbercurry after James Gorman returned home from India and his imprisonment in English jails. James returned to Ireland, to Tubbercurry in 1923 after the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and a year later he married his wife Bridget Travers. He settled into home life gradually after 8 adventurous years in the army, where he served in Palestine during World War I and in India where the mutiny occurred. He set up a little business as a fishmonger, purchasing fish from Donegal and selling them in Tubbercurry on the streets and down on the square, calling to private houses and cycling around South Sligo. James Gorman never drove a car, he cycled every place. When the Drama Festival started in St. Bridget's Hall in Tubbercurry in the mid-1940s, he became the props manager. Like an army quartermaster, he borrowed furniture as required for local drama groups from houses around the area, and in military-style fashion, he returned them the next day in perfect condition. Backdrops for the stage were also his charge, and he even performed occasionally on stage with the local drama group, the Phoenix Players. He infamously once played a soldier in the play Journey's End, a role he was ideally suited for. Local soccer teams and the Sligo Rovers were also his pleasure, and he carried a prayer book and a rosary, I'm told, and in the prayer book was a few leaves that he picked from the Garden of Gethsemane during his time in Palestine, in Jerusalem. As many students of World War I will know, returning veterans to Ireland got a tough time and were shunned by so-called nationalists of the New Ireland. These World War veterans were often castigated for being in the British Army and for taking the King's shilling. This did not happen, however, to James Gorman, as he was viewed differently because he was a mutineer. He had raised the tricolour in defiance of the Crown. James Gorman lived a full life in Tubbercurry after the mutiny and died in 1977 at the age of 81. We in Tubbercurry community are proud to be associated with this acknowledgement of the Connaught Rangers and their actions in India. I hope you enjoy the rest of the programme this afternoon, and I'll be here to help you if anybody has any questions, and we'll be delighted to help you. Gurumila Mayagat.
Thanks, Roger, for that short history of Tubbercurry, and very enlightening and putting the place in the picture. Now, I'd just like to mention that the next two speakers are the relatives of mutineers, and it's been a long journey, in particular with myself and Mary on this project, and Brendan. It's very moving for some of the relatives. They felt that this should have been done a long time ago, but there's no time like the present, I always believe. And it's happening today, which is great. And I just want to say that it was a pleasure working with Mary and Brendan on this project to date. And there was no barriers that couldn't be removed. They were just tremendous with me. So the first speaker we have is granddaughter of James Gorman, Mary Henry. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. You're all most welcome to Chatliney this afternoon to our official launch, especially the families of the mutineers, the Scanlon and Conlon families from Sligo, Gorman family from Tubbercurry, Elphin, County Roscommon, Dundalk and Ballina. We've just met some new cousins. We also would like to acknowledge Sean Reid from Kilkenny, who has drove the whole way from Kilkenny today. He is representing the Willis family. His great-grandfather was Patrick Willis. And we cannot forget the famous Kerrigan family from Glencar, County Leitrim. You're most welcome. We're delighted you're here this evening. And to all the families of the mutineers that are watching us around the world, Céad Míle Fáilte. My grandfather was James Gorman, as has been said. He was born in Tubbercurry in 1896. He was the son of James and Anne Gorman, ní McGuinn. His father came from Ballina and his mother came from Curry. Grandfather was the father figure in our house when we were growing up, as in the late 50s and early 60s, my dad worked in England. He had 19 grandchildren in Ireland, England and Australia, and we were privileged to have had him in our lives until 1977. He really was a wonderful man, and we loved him dearly. We knew he was in the Connaught Rangers, but he never talked about the mutiny. The first we knew of his involvement in the mutiny was in 1970, when RTE approached him to take part in a documentary they were making to coincide with the repatriation of James Daly, Peter Sears and Patrick Smith. He kept in touch with many of his fellow mutineers, and indeed he attended many of their funerals. This commemoration project is designed to tell the story and to honour the memory of those courageous men who, while far from home, they stood in solidarity with their fellow countrymen, fighting for our independence and the establishment of the Irish Republic. This project is part of Sligo County Council's Decade of Centenaries, the state commemorating significant historic events that took place between 1918 and 1923. Just a brief snap of the Connaught Rangers themselves. They were a regiment in the British Army. The 1st Battalion were based in Wellington Barracks, Julanda, in the Punjab. News of martial law and the reprisals of the Black and Tans reached the Connaught Rangers in India. They reacted by reports of brutality by British forces in Ireland by an act of simple defiance. They refused to obey orders and grounded arms. The Union flag in the barracks was replaced by the flag of the Irish Republic. Officer Deacon addressed the Rangers and he pointed out the consequences of the mutiny. First attempts at persuasion, then threats of execution, court-martial, and then followed by grueling hardship. They tried to break the spirits of the mutineers. The Rangers in Julanda sent 2 soldiers to the company in Solon, a military outpost near the Tibetan border. This is where my grandfather was stationed. And on hearing what was happened in Julanda, the Rangers in Solon joined the mutiny. They were led by James Daly. They also grounded arms and refused to obey orders, and sang rebel songs, I believe, and raised the tricolour. Their demands were very simple. They were refusing to serve in the British Army until the British soldiers left Ireland. Their chaplain, Father Baker, persuaded the Rangers to hand in their arms. The following day, with rumours of a massacre in Julanda and scouts' reports of advance of troops in Solon outpost, the peaceful protest took a decisively serious turn. Rangers led by James Daly and armed with bayonets attempted to retrieve their arms from the armoury, resulting in the deaths of Private Sears and Smith. Private Eugene Egan, who was a great friend of my grandfather's, travelled many miles together to different funerals. Eugene was wounded. The mutineers were arrested and they were taken to Dagshy prison. In Julanda, 4 platoons went to Wellington Barracks with fixed bayonets, marched the mutineers to an open compound surrounded by barbed wire. They were left in this open compound without adequate water, food or shelter under the unbearable sun. With the prospect of disease breaking out and some of the mutineers already suffering various degrees of sunstroke and becoming very ill, Dr. Carney, having seen the inhuman way the mutineers were treated, he intervened. He insisted that they were removed from the open compound and they were sent to lockdown detention prison. Later, all the mutineers were transported to Dagshai. In August 1920, court-martial's proceedings began at Army headquarters. 14 Rangers were sentenced to death. 13 later had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Others were given up to 20 years penal servitude. Private James Daly was executed by firing squad on the 2nd of November 1920 in Dagshai prison yard. He was the last member of the British forces to be executed for mutiny. The deaths were a time of great grief, but it also bound the mutineers together for life. It's what kept them going during the dark days that followed. In December 1920, the mutineers were removed from Dagshai prison and returned to England to serve the remainder of their sentences. In January 1921, they arrived in Portland prison. After a number of weeks, they were removed to Maidstone and other prisons around England. Whilst in prison, the mutineers went on hunger strike twice, protesting at the ill treatment. Many of the mutineers suffered bad health all their lives as a result of this treatment. The mutineers remained in prison until the 3rd of January 1923. They were released following the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. They returned to Ireland, their families and communities seldom knowing the hardship that they had endured. Their actions faded away, and I'm sorry to say they became Ireland's forgotten heroes. Followers of Mahatma Gandhi interpreted the mutiny as an example of passive resistance and civil disobedience, and the Connaught Rangers as anti-imperialist heroes. It is reported that Gandhi himself sympathised with the stand the mutineers took, and it's reported that he went to Dagshai prison and stayed overnight as an act of protest. The actions taken by the Rangers did more for the Irish struggle of independence than any amount of literature or any number of envoys sent abroad. The story of the Rangers was reported in America, and there is no doubt what effects their actions had on world opinion. It highlighted Ireland's struggle for independence. My grandfather was one of only 3 Sligo men. Now we have 4. We're delighted to have found our other comrade. The others were Jack Scanlon, Martin Conlon from Sligo Town, and Patrick Dyer from Ballymote. They were true Irishmen when it mattered most. They stood up for the cause, Irish cause on foreign soil. My grandfather first enlisted in the British Army on the 3rd of May 1915 in King's House, Boyle. His battalion was sent to Palestine until 1918, and he re-enlisted in 1919 in Sligo Town Hall. He came from a military family, as Roger has said. His father fought in the Boer War, and on the outbreak of the Great War in 1914-18, he volunteered for active service again. He was the recipient of the South African Medals 1914-15 Star British and Victorian Medals. After he returned to Tubbercurry, he died in 1949. This is my grandfather's father we're talking about. When my grandfather was released from Maidstone Prison in 1923, he also returned to Tubbercurry. He married a wonderful woman, Bridget Travers, from Mount Edward, North Sligo. They got married in Mullabreen at Conwy, County Sligo, on the 15th of the 6th, 1923. They also had 6 children, all sadly now deceased. His daughter, Mary Lambert, she would be known as Baby Gorman, died only this summer. She was so proud of her father, and she looked forward to the monument in Tubbercurry to honour the memory of those brave Sligo men. In my opinion, the Connaught Rangers mutiny in India in 1920 has been airbrushed out of Irish history. In present-day school history books, when addressing the War of Independence, it very rightly mentions the execution of Kevin Barry on the 1st of November 1920. But there is no mention of the execution of James Daly on the 2nd of November 1920. Didn't those 2 brave young men give their lives for the same cause? There's been many books and papers written about the mutiny, and no doubt they disagree with aspects of the story of the mutiny, as remembered by the mutineers themselves. I know my grandfather always broke down when he spoke about James Daly. He always was very emotional. And James Daly was his very good friend and comrade. He felt his loss very personally. In total, 38 Connaught Rangers were awarded service pensions in recognition of their military role they played in the War of Independence. I think we should honour the memory of those courageous men, and they should not let become Ireland's forgotten heroes. Garamaiva.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is also a relation of one of the mutineers, the grandnephew of Jack Scanlon, in fact, and our next speaker is former county councillor whom I've met and worked with over the years, and also he's a renowned local historian himself. So I'd like to welcome to the podium now Brian Scanlon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here today. I just want to say that I've been involved in another project for the last couple of years regarding the monument for the First World War. My mother's side is Conlon, which is related to the Martin Conlon that's mentioned here today, and most of the councillors would know we've been up to our eyes trying to erect a monument for the men of the First World War. Still ongoing, and the reason I'm saying all this is that Mary Henry rang me 6 or 7 months ago regarding the mutiny in India, and you know, I was telling her that I was so busy, and I just have to say it today here in front of you all that she never let go. You know, she kept at it, and whoever gets the pat on the back for what's going on here today, I think that you know, the biggest thing is owed to Mary, and I'd like you to all to give her a round of applause. Well done, and I'm not hiding from the phone number on the phone anymore now. I'll answer it anymore. Jack Scanlon was born in the Rope Walk in 1899 in Sligo Town. The Rope Walk today is basically St. Bridget's Place. It ran from Pilkington Terrace, where the Ulster Bank was there on Pearse Road. It ran the whole way across Lower St. Bridget's and out to Millcoach Road. And there was a rope walk in every major town in the British Isles that had a port. It was where they made the ropes for the ships, and you had to have a long straight area in order to tie ropes and roll them and make them. And Jack Scanlon was born there in 1899, and he had 3 other brothers, Michael, Tom, my grandfather, and Patrick. Tom was the youngest, which was my grandfather. And I didn't know Jack Scanlon, because Jack Scanlon died in April 1964. I was 3 years of age, and but I used to visit my grandfather every Sunday, and the ritual was that I was brought on a good day by the hand up to the cemetery, and we went in the old gate at the top of the Gaelic Park and down to his family graves, and he would arrive at his parents' grave with his brother in it, Jack, and he would tell me the stories of the Connaught Rangers and the mutiny, and I suppose I was like most children. I used to be coming down the path when I was 8, 9, 10 years of age, getting close to this Scanlon grave, and I'd say, Jesus Christ, here we go again, the mutiny. You know? It was probably a bit of a scene like Only Fools and Horses, the no war, don't mention the war, or not the war again, but it stuck with me, and I was the oldest grandchild in the town, belonged to the Scanlons, and it never left me. And I had the pleasure about 20 years ago of actually putting an extra inscription on the bottom of the grave, veteran of Indian Mutiny 1920. I thought it was very important to put it under his name. It was about 20 years ago. At the same time, I actually went out to Glencairn to visit Charlie Currigan's grave, because he was very much part of Jack Scanlon's story. Because when my grandfather told me about Jack Scanlon, the only time Jack ever talked about the mutiny was when he had a pint with Charlie Currigan in McGlynn's pub in Old Market Street. He never spoke about it apart from that. He was greatly affected by the mutiny. He had marks on his neck where there was an attempt to hang him before the trial, and he would never stand in a photograph. We actually have no photograph of him at weddings or anything. I actually required a photograph about a month ago of men marching in 1936 in Dublin at the GPO. It was the 20th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and they were invited up, and they're carrying a banner with Connaught Rangers 1920 on it, and there's about 8 men in it, and I brought the photograph to a niece of Jack's, who's alive in Dooley Park, but it's in her 80s, and she didn't feel she could come up today. But she picked out who she thinks is Jack Scanlon, so we think we actually have a photograph of Jack Scanlon. But Jack Scanlon, to anyone that was reared in St. Bridget's, St. Joseph's, around the Wayne Bridge, Mailcoach Road, Sligo, back in, they were born in the 50s, around that time, he was only known as the mutineer, and he was a quiet man that never spoke to anyone. And he wore a large trench coat with a large scarf around his neck to hide the marks on his neck. And I was talking to a lady who would be in her 60s now, who was reared around the same areas where Jack was, and she was telling me one day that when it was getting dark in the summer and all the kids that time were all playing out on the street, the mothers used to come out, and in order to get the kids in, try to get them in at night, used to scare them and say, if you don't come in, the mutineer will get you. It was just the strange man standing at the Wayne Bridge that never spoke. And, you know, he never married because, you know, he was that affected that he wouldn't stand in a photograph. He never married, he never mixed. And according to my grandfather, his brother, the only time he ever spoke in a mutiny, as I said, is when he had a pint with Charlie Corrigan. So I spoke on the radio there a few days ago, and I thought it was very important to mention Charlie Corrigan because he can't come into this party because he's 200 or 300 yards, I believe, in the Leitrim side of the border. But you know, I thought it was important to include him because he was so much part of Jack Scanlon's story. Just to kind of finish on a note of tragedies in families, Jack's father was a docker on the quay, and in 1928 they were digging out a corn boat, and the corn boat was lying against the side of the quay when the tide was out. He was 52 years of age, and they were down emptying the corn on one side of the boat, and they used to lower down big buckets into it and fill the corn and pull them up on derricks and swing them out on the quay. And one side of the boat was empty of corn, the side that was getting unloaded nearest to the jetties. And when the tide was coming in, it rose the boat and it lifted the boat, and Jack was in the hull of the boat, and she, with all the weight of the corn on one side, she swung the corn in the boat, and the boat tilted out into the river, and he was actually buried in the corn, and before they got him out he drowned in the corn. That was Jack's father. So he died at 52. So that was only 5 years after Jack was released from prison. So that's what happened to my great-grandfather and Jack's father. But I'm delighted. I have talked for years about Jack Scanlon. I've talked for years about the mutiny 20 years, 30 years ago. I actually was turning into my grandfather and my young kids about it, you know, the mutiny. And I'm delighted today what is happening. And, you know, and I really, really feel that it's really down to Mary Henry. And I thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Brian, for that. Our next speaker, we now move in, we have 3 speakers from academia, and as I said, they will set the picture for us in terms of the research they've undertaken over the years. And our first speaker is Professor Ewan O'Halpin of Trinity College. Professor O'Halpin is Professor of Contemporary Irish History in TCD, and in fact is actually a grandnephew of Kevin Barry, which is an interesting, after what Mary mentioned there. And Professor O'Halpin is renowned in the world of history. He's written extensively in the politics of Ireland and the history of Ireland. So without any... Oh, and I just want to mention, at the end of the speakers now, we will have a roving mic for about 5 minutes for any questions you might have to ask of the academics. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Ewan O'Halpin to come up. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks in particular to Mary for inviting me here. And I might ask, I'll look at Mary, I'll need a signal, either collective snoring or otherwise, to stop talking, okay? Because that's been the story of my life. I'm very glad to be here today. I'm very glad there's so many people here with family connections to the Rangers. I think in terms of what we heard earlier about Martin Scanlon and about Mary's grandfather, there is a peculiarity in terms of the passing on of what's discussed and what isn't discussed in families. And I have a couple of instances here, I'm afraid, from my own extended family, but it's a general point. We assume that that sort of family lore is collected and passed on systematically, but it's not. And what happens in the passing on of family lore, as I'll tell you in a minute, in my case, is that some stories dominate and others are completely ignored for one reason or another, right? And it can be, the focus is on typically on one person, in my case, Kevin Barry, which I'll come to. And you miss out on huge amounts of other parts of family history because the person who's most interested in that part of the story, there isn't space in their world, as it were, to say, well, there's also this and that and the other. And I'm sure it's also the case in relation to the families of the Rangers here, families of Republicans from Sligo in this era, families of British military connected with Sligo in this era, and families of RIC, because there must be some people. I boast of my blue blood in the sense that my grandfather was a Garda sergeant. I also bottle green blood. His father and two brothers were in the RIC. Right? My grandfather became a Garda sergeant, Hugh Halfpenny, because he'd been commanded a battalion in East Down in the IRA during the War of Independence. But I also have, if in military terms, on my mother's side, my great-grandfather, P.J. Maloney, was Sinn Féin TD in 1918 in Tip. His eldest son, my grandfather, was a senior officer, blah, 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 in the IRA. But his youngest half-brother, who was only 6 years older than Jim Maloney, whom I never heard of, he spent the War of Independence in the RAF because he had joined the Royal Irish Rangers in 1914, ended up moving to the Royal Flying Corps, and he was flying aircraft in the Balkans, which sounds very exciting and interesting, until 1919, and joined the Free State Army in 1923. So within families, there's often things that, not necessarily out of shame or whatever, but just don't get mentioned and don't get explored. And that's why I think whether we're looking at the Rangers, whether we're looking at the wider War of Independence, I've just completed a very long study, long because of my inefficiency as well as everything else, called The Dead of the Irish Revolution. And I'll throw up a few figures from that now in a minute. But what we're seeing in recent years, we're seeing two things. We're seeing the incentive of the decade of commemoration, where we begin to talk about people and about groups and about incidents which perhaps in one way or another have been neglected, right, or we feel they have. But Mary said, apropos of, for example, of Kevin Barry versus James Daly, you could equally make the point about Michael Fitzgerald, whoever he was. Michael Fitzgerald died, I think, on the 24th of October 1920 on hunger strike. His comrade died, I think, 2 days later after 76 days on hunger strike, both of them in Cork prison. But the IRA chose to focus, the Sinn Féin and so on, for obvious reasons. They focused on Terence McSweeney because he had the title of Lord Mayor of Cork. And he was the one who got the international attention, right, in his very heroic hunger strike. But there were two fellows in Cork hunger striking, in one case for longer, about whom there was the separatist movement chose not to focus on them. In relation to James Daly, there's a brief report in the Times of India, I think, that he's been convicted. He's not even named. But here, there's no great agitation on the part, of the independence movement about that whole body of 14 men who've been sentenced to death. Before Daly actually is executed, the others their sentences commuted. So there are choices that not only that history makes, but even at the time that political parties and political organisations make as to who it is going to be the one whose sacrifice is going to be focused on. Now, in recent years, excuse me, I've got a bad cold. We've been lobbying for many years for the release of material with which now we're all almost too familiar. That's, say, the records, the Bureau of Military History. I was involved in lobbying for that for years and years and years. And a lot of what we know now, including some about the Rangers, you'll get in the Bureau. Even more important in some ways, and I'm sure some of you have used these records, you have that sort of worn-out, cross-eyed expression, because they are hard to use, but they're incredible, which is the military service pensions records. And I, again, was involved in lobbying for the release of them. A good fairy sent me what I thought was my grandfather Jim Maloney's file in in the early 2000s, and I sent bits of that file to the then Taoiseach, because I discovered to my amazement there was a transcript of my grandfather being interviewed in 1935 and of his brigade officers being interviewed about him, a verbatim transcript in relation to his pension. I wrote to the Taoiseach, as did others and so on. I'm not claiming the sole credit, but it was an effective way of making the lobby. Now, when I lobbied for those records to be released, I said, it's ridiculous. I wrote a piece in the paper, 18,000 files, and they aren't released. Of course, I was wrong. I'm generally wrong. There are over 300,000 files. Mother of God. I should have known that if there's anything to do with pensions, there's going to be a lot of correspondence. And for everybody who got a pension, as we know, less than 1 in 5 applicants actually received one. So there's plenty and plenty of correspondence. My grandfather, Jim Maloney's pension ends on the 5th of April, file on the 5th of April 1981, because he dies. Do you see what I mean? So these are enormous records, and they document the history not only of the successful, but of the unsuccessful. And they're really powerful in terms of family history, because you'll see not only extraordinary things that your relatives may have been involved in, or somebody who might have shot one of your relatives, right? But you'll see the conditions in which people lived. In Ireland, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the kind of ordinary people with very few resources, and you'll get the equivalent of social welfare reports, which is typically a Garda sergeant calling out to a widow or something, and coming back and saying, 1928, this woman has 1 cow. You know, she has 6 children, and blah, and blah. So they're really extraordinarily powerful records for various reasons. In relation to the Rangers, we have the Connaught Rangers pension records. I don't know if they've all been released, but the ones that have been released are fascinating. I'll just say a little bit, this is slightly incomprehensible, sorry, I was messing around. In terms of the Irish Revolution, the place where most people die, I'm counting death, which is a very bad measure in one way, it's a good measure in another. It doesn't count injuries, doesn't count long-term trauma, it doesn't count property or whatever. But you can see, if you look here, so I have Sligo at 1%, so Sligo is there isn't a huge amount of killing in Sligo in these years. Sligo gets more violent in the Civil War era. You'll see that Dublin is at almost 30%, has the largest single county in terms of actual deaths. Okay, an awful lot of those deaths take place in a single week in 1916. About 453 of them, I think. Right? There's a few more deaths around the country. If you go to 1917 to 21, the picture changes a bit. Now Cork is where Cork feels it always should be, has the most fatalities, right? Dublin is next. But what the most striking thing of these two things should be the one, Antrim, the third most violent place in Ireland in these years, from 1917 to 21. It isn't Tip or Kerry or places you might think. It's Antrim, Antrim is the county of Belfast. And when we talk about the Irish Revolution and so on, the impact of it, we have to remember we're talking about 32 counties, not 26. Are we agreed on that? Yes, we are. And there's an enormous number of deaths in Antrim, and there's an enormous proportion of those are civilian deaths. Quite unlike in Sligo, where there's almost no civilian deaths here in 1920 or 21, right? So it's a different kettle of fish. There's I don't know, that's probably not very satisfactory, but the map the diagram shows is these are deaths in total. I'm not doing it by relative to the population of the county, and that's an important difference. But in effect, Fermanagh and Wicklow have less than 10. So these are lots of Ireland. The general point is, you see what I mean? There's not many people being killed. And typically, for example, in Wicklow, where there's 9 deaths, two of those deaths are in a single incident, where a house is burgled by a black and tan who kills the house owner, who's a member of the Church of Ireland and a wealthy farmer. So you might think it was a sectarian IRA killing. In fact, it's the drunken black and tan who has just arrived in the town. His friend then kills himself, and he gets hanged. The killer gets hanged in March 1921 in Mountjoy. So the pattern of violence varies widely. It's very strongly, obviously, in terms of body count. It's concentrated in Munster, but you also have Dublin and you have Antrim. And you can see the three counties. Cork has the most deaths, Dublin second most, Antrim third. But Antrim proportionately has a huge number of civilian deaths. It's a different kind of conflict, but it's part of the wider conflict. These probably, it may be hard to see these, and I apologise that the lighting ain't great for them. But you can see this is a conflict where quite a lot of civilians died, proportionate to the combatants. I won't go into who dies where, but sorry, I've just done these, so that's why I'm showing them to you. Probably don't make much sense, but there you go. This is a useful chart because it shows you the way the violence works. Now I'm measuring fatalities. Tubbercurry, for example, wasn't there burning houses burnt here quite early on? So sometimes you get local violence which doesn't map the national picture, and you get local violence. So this is the kind of violence that primarily the Rangers were hearing, not of civilians being slaughtered. They were hearing of towns being broken up, and of houses being burnt, right? and of what became an official policy of doing things like destroying the local creamery. So in a sense, they were, right? But they were hearing what they were hearing. So what they're hearing of by and large isn't death, it's destruction rather than death. They're hearing about what's called reprisals, but in a lot of parts of the country, by the autumn of 1920, reprisals were being carried out where there hadn't been any action. Do you follow me? In other words, what's happening is particularly Black and Tans are coming along and they're beating up a town to show that they're now the boss. It's not because somebody got shot, right, necessarily, or certainly that there'd been a killing. And I think that's why the word reprisals is a bit deceptive, because in fact, a lot of what the Rangers are hearing about is a combination of what I call license in discipline, particularly by the newer forces, particularly by the Black and Tans in Sligo as elsewhere. I mean, Tubbercurry does feature itself not only as a place which is sacked quite early, one of the first deaths of a Sligo man, because as well as deaths in Sligo, where there aren't very many, but 15 or 16, I think, in the 2 years, 20 and 21, you have people from Sligo who die elsewhere. Right, there's a couple of IRA volunteers who get killed, and there's 5 or 6 policemen, and who die elsewhere, but are from Sligo. One a man, Brennan, I can think of in August 1920, actually from this town, from Tubbercurry. To turn to the Rangers themselves, one of the surprises of the pensions records relate to a man called William Coman. Sorry, can you hear me? Because I'm very hoarse. Coman is an interesting figure. He may, for example, there may be descendants of his around, because it's clear from the file that he did have a wife and child, but the wife is actually looking for him in the late 1930s, so I don't know what happened there. But what's most striking about his file is this document here. It's the back of an envelope in which he has written about his pension. He finally secures a pension under the Connaught Rangers legislation, I think in 1936, perhaps 37. But I don't know, can you read can anybody read that? And what does it say? Berlin, exactly. Why is he writing to the Department of Defense from Berlin? It's a letter dated 1943. He's a prisoner of war. He rejoins the British Army in 1937, ticks a box saying, yes, I was involved in a mutiny. Shows you what the army is like. They actually have a form where if you've been involved in a mutiny, you have to say so. It doesn't mean they won't take you, because you're a trained soldier after all, for God's sake, right? So he's back in the army. He gets captured in France in 1940, and he spends the rest of the war as a guest of the German army in various prisoners of war camps. Now, Coleman was quite a character. He was from Cashel and Tipperary. He seems to have moved about a bit before and after the war, never to have settled down. I don't know to what extent he related. He stayed in touch with his sort of mutineer comrades and so on. But his file is amazing, because he gets into trouble a few times after the war with the law. in various ways, and ultimately his pension is taken away from him. Now, it's very clear by then that he's not a rich man, he's not a settled man, whatever. He commits quite a few public order offences and so on, which suggests that he's not terribly stable. And in the end, he loses his pension because he gets a sentence of more than, I think it's three months or 6 months for stealing a bicycle, I think. So it's hardly a major crime. But ultimately, he does, in fact, the file, in a sense, ends happily in that his pension is ultimately restored, by which time he's about 62 or 63. And that's all we know about Coleman. But I don't know what surprised, but this is an example, if you like, of the level of detail and the depth that you will get into in these records. I'm sure some of you, have you been, Mary, have you looked at any pensions records, yeah? Yeah, I mean, they're on the web, and they take a bit of getting used to. Would you agree?
Yes, but they give a lot of information. You know, it's easy to trace people through pensions. I found any of the people I was looking for. So it was much easier for me to be able to locate people where they were. For instance, James Daly's niece lives in Tullamore, but you assume they would live in Turles Pass.
Yeah.
There is nobody there now, so through the pensions, you'll be able to follow where the people were buried and where they applied for their pension. So you had an area that you could research to find the information you were looking for.
And I think it's worth saying, here's one really good tip. You probably know this. When you go onto the website, don't try to read the files on the website, because it takes forever. Go save them as, and just download them, and it works really quick. Okay, so that's William Coleman as an example. I should say as well, just somebody mentioned Charlie Kerrigan, the members of the Kerrigan family here. Yesterday I was in the library in Ballinamore. Like this, a beautiful building, and I suspect like this, certainly they're having to reduce their opening hours because they don't have enough staff. I hope this would never happen in Sligo libraries. It would be a scandal if it did. But I was reading Charlie Kerrigan was interviewed twice by a local history project. Centred on the Ballinamore Library by Sean O'Sullivan, I think, was then the county librarian. And it's extremely interesting, and it's those interviews, because he talks about his life, he talks about his where he grew up, he talks about his family circumstances, he talks about, it's not simply focused on the mutiny, although he has a lot to say on that, but it's about his life before and his life after. And if you want to know why I think the 7th of 9 children in a family in a 2-room cottage, why he joins the army, well, I think I've given you the answer. Well, what else did you do? He wasn't going to inherit whatever little land there was, which was nothing. There was literally the Connaught Rangers. It's not a so many young men join the British military because that's the traditional way out. Because you can't. There is just no life for you. And even many of them, when they come back, they're considered local millionaires locally, because at least they have a regular income, be it from ultimately from the Irish state, as the mutineers did, or as ex-servicemen from His Majesty the King, but they're not getting paid, golden sovereigns every week. They're getting a pittance, a pittance, a pittance. So these people who, in terms of what their reward for their services is very slight indeed. And their motivations for joining, sometimes they joined, a lot of them joined because of, if you like, the Redmondite thing, like my grandfather's half-brother who was older than them. It was the natural thing to do, to join up in 1914. Others joined because they're from families, generation after generation after generation. What you did was, when you grew up, you joined the army. And there's no disgrace in that at all. In terms of the mutiny itself, I don't want to steal Mario's clothes, although they look rather neater than mine. Maybe here. I just to make a point about the mutiny and why Daly was executed. There was, as the judge Babington or whatever describes, and as Mario is going to describe, there was a debate and there was an issue about was this. You had the issues for the British government in India, and you have issues for the British government in London, right? And in fact, it was the man, the Secretary of State for India, E.S. Montagu, who was a very interesting figure, who had been offered the job of Chief Secretary for Ireland after the Rising, and said, no, I won't do it. And he had a number of reasons, including what he called his Jewish race. I think he was probably right, because there would have been a lot of antagonism towards him, but he's a very intelligent, reflective politician. And he raises the question, are we right to execute potentially 14 men for mutiny? And he also, there's an argument as to whether the question should have come to him in London as the political head, the political head of the India office, or whether it should go simply to the army and be dealt with by the Viceroy. And the British view in India is unequivocal. We have to execute the leader of this mutiny. It's clearly Daly, and we have to do this because Montagu has said the point is if we don't execute people, if there is an Anglo-Irish settlement, chances are prisoners will be released, right? And one of the interesting things about Montagu's point is he's absolutely right. And in fact, we're now very familiar with prisoners being that's their part of the deal. Look at 1998, look at the Good Friday Agreements and so on. That's what you do, right? Prisoners are part of the bargaining counter. You can't bargain with a dead man. The body of a dead man, as a word. You see what I mean? And Montagu raises that question, and he gets there's a sort of a bureaucratic row about it. But this is a telegram from India to London. It's a kind of I wouldn't use a coarse term, but it's a kind of a PFO, if you like. But you can see, so this is the Viceroy sending. Reprieve wasn't entertained in one case only because the prisoner that's Daly, was the ringleader throughout, maintained a spirit of flagrant defiance for more than 24 hours, blah, blah, until arrested. You should realise that in this case, the interests of Ireland have not only to be appraised, but also the possibility of maintaining in the future discipline in the Indian Army. In other words, we'll never, if I can use the term, we'll never be able to control our native troops, right? Never be able to hang them again, and they'd hanged a good few, especially in Singapore in 1916, I think it was, right, for mutiny, if we don't hang a white man for what has happened now. Do you see what I mean? Otherwise, the sort of indigenous Indian army, which was very numerous and particularly very much dominated by North Indians, particularly from the Punjab, Indians and disproportionately Muslims and Sikhs rather than Hindus. That's a digression. And so what the Viceroy is saying, it's for the sake of the control of India, we have to hang at least one person, because of this blatant act of mutiny and so on, which is carried out, if you like, in full view of the Indian population, who are by then becoming, partly because of a calamity the previous year, a calamity for which responsibility lay with a man called Sir Michael O'Dwyer from Tipperary, who was Vice-Governor of the Punjab at the time of the Amritsar massacre in May 1919, which really radicalised Indian opinion generally, when 379 or more Indians are killed in an enclosure out of which they can't get when troops fire without warning under the orders of a man called Brigadier Dyer. The troops firing, by the way, are Gurkhas, which is part of the complexity of colonialism. You're using, if you like, people from the locality to enforce order. With this kind of material, it's evident that the British in India got the message that we can't allow the Irish in India to act rebelliously, because that weakens our hold on what the Indian people themselves do. I'm not sure, there isn't much evident sympathy between the mutineers and the Indian people, I have to say. By and large, there's very little connection in the narratives that we've seen of Charlie Kerrigan and others. They don't mix much at all. But the point is, as a private soldier in India, you could buy Kerrigan in fact says it, others say it, for a couple of pennies, everything was done for you. I think for 4 annas, which he says is about 4 pennies, somebody would shave you 7 days a week, right? Your washing, anything like that would be done by local men for just a tiny amount of money. So in some ways, there was a transactional relationship with Indians generally, but there wasn't any great political connection, I think it's safe to say. How am I doing on time? I can tell. Okay. Just to mention that there is quite a lot of material. Again, I don't want to talk about it much. This is a War Office file listing. I've just taken one document from it. You can see dailies at the top. You can see written in. This is one of 4 groups of mutineers, and that kind of material is easily available. By and large, you have to go to. This is from the National Archives in Kew. The previous document was from the British Library, which is where the records of the India Office are, which was that part of the British government which dealt with Delhi. Now to talk about memory and family. I knew this old lady pretty well, right? Her name is Kathy Maloney, my grandmother, my mother's mother. Now, I knew her very well. I didn't know this woman very well because she never talked about her. And the woman on the right is herself as a dynamic young woman and Sinn Féin activist and so on, who went to America in 1922 with Countess Markovich to raise money for the Republic, went to America in 1924. About 3 weeks after her wedding, she goes to Australia. Not on a honeymoon, she leaves my poor grandfather at home. He just got out of jail, gets married, and then his wife goes to Australia to raise money for the Republic. But she never spoke about herself as a young woman, except solely in the context of this chap, of her dead brother Kevin, right? And so she spoke a lot to us about Kevin. If you hurt your knee, she would say, be a brave Republican soldier, right? She meant Kevin. Everything was about Kevin and Kevin and Kevin. And that's fine in one way, you know, Kevin Barry, significant figure. She never spoke about this chap. That's her husband's brother, Paddy Maloney, who was killed on 1st of May 1921 outside Tip Town in a fight. She never spoke about him. I found out about him because I inquiring mind. And after my grandmother's death in the 1970s, I asked my grandfather, who never spoke at all about the War of Independence or Civil War. He was on Liam Lynch's staff. He was in prison till July 24. He never spoke about anything to his children or anyone else. Of course, I asked him a couple of questions. I'm sorry I didn't ask him more. But I said, what happened to Paddy? And he gave me his version. But his wife had never told us about this other dead chap, right? And it's nothing personal. They were very happily married and very close. It's clear from their correspondence. But it's just my grandmother didn't see the importance. Do you follow me? So she had her famous dead brother and her husband's not so famous dead brother. It kind of didn't matter. And that's what I mean about family narratives. There could be, in terms of the Connaught Rangers, there could be other people in the family who were had other interesting histories and so on. And they get left out, not because there's something shameful or shocking, just because whoever the custodian of the memory of Kevin is, ain't interested in the other side. And there was a knock-on effect. Well, my father's side, my grandfather was a Republican, Hugh Halfpenny from County Down. My granny, he was dead before I was born, but Granny and Letterkenny never spoke about her husband, or about the War of Independence, and so on. A little bit, when I was a research student, I asked her a few questions and she'd answer. But she never spoke about it because Kevin Barry overshadowed all that. Do you follow me? And this is typical of families. I'm sorry, it's not particular. And just to give an example, the most telling thing I found about my grandfather is his pension record, which was leaked to me. That's why I had it early, right? And it's the difference as to how you commemorate and what you say. This is him in 1935, right? In his last 7th period, which is, I think it's April 21 to is it August or July 21. You're on full-time service. He was in the 4th Battalion, 3rd Tipperary Brigade. For full-time service as battalion quartermaster and adjutant, yes. You're holding the 2 positions, and he answers, no. The adjutant was killed and I took his place. I was appointed adjutant on the 1st of May 1921. And what doesn't he say? And I think it's greatly to his credit, because he was very short of money. He doesn't say the adjutant was my brother, right? So within the same family, you've one person, my grandmother, for various reasons, who talks constantly about her dead brother. And you have her husband, in a technical thing to do with his position in the 4th Battalion. The thing, he doesn't say, well, I became adjutant because my brother was killed. No, he doesn't bring his body in, brother's body, plonk it on the table and say, give us a few bob. I think it's very interesting. I had no idea until obviously till I got this record that was question had even been asked. I think it's a very powerful one. I'll just say finally an example of how these records, even for historians, I'm probably past my time, how they strike home. And this again, equally, when you look at if you haven't done your research on your Connaught Rangers relatives, do so through the pensions. Mary will show you how, right? But I felt this letter was only released about 3 weeks ago. I saw it online. I don't know if you could read it. But it's from Glencar Letterkenny, 4th of May 1943. It's Department of Defence. My husband, for whom a military service certificate came today, died on Easter Monday, 26th of April. That's 1943. I've signed enclosed form, blah, blah, hope it'll be all right. I hope to be generous towards him if possible, as he has left a family of 13 children behind him, none of whom are earning anything. The youngest was born 3 weeks before his death. Will you please instruct me what to do in regard to pension certificate awarded? Sincerely yours, Annie Halpenny. Now, that's my grandmother, right? She's writing that letter on the 4th of May, which is a week after her husband has died. He was a Garda sergeant, but he, as I say, he had been what's called a vice brigadier in Down. All the kids, the eldest kid, my dad, was then in a kind of flight of sort of religious folly, was in the Jesuits, but he left the Jesuits when his father died, which is why I'm here. I probably wouldn't be here otherwise, so you never know. So she had 13 children, and none of them working, because she was, as some of you are the products of, and as some of your grandparents were like that, she pushed them all through education, right? They all, with the exception of my namesake who died at about the age of 10, she pushed them all through. And that last one, born 3 weeks before his death, my Aunt Mary came back from Canada 2 years ago, and I was just chatting to her about Granny and how, I like Granny a lot. I used to go and see her, and her account of her childhood is so different than I had assumed, because Mary is the last in the family. By the time Mary's 10 or 11, right, my dad is making quite a lot of money. His brothers are teachers, his sisters are nurses, and in other words, there's plenty of money coming into the house now. So I thought Mary had the darling daughter, that she had a comfortable childhood, and her account of her childhood is one dominated by her mother. By the age of 38, having just no, as she says her mother said to her, I just have no love left to give you because I'm so burdened, right? And so her whole, but also, and I'll end here, but this is typical, this is a point about gender. I did once ask Granny in the late 70s, because she was married at 18 in County Down, 1922. What about the troubles and so on? Her brother Dan Rice was a prominent IRA man, and she described, a couple of times the house being raided and broken up, and bran being thrown around and so on. There's a song about Dora, this terrible girl. I don't know, some of you may know it, comes in and breaks all the crockery and smashes the windows and things. So she described it in very deadpan terms. That's all. She said, I carried dispatches and things. But that was fine. But her daughter, Mary, told me that she told her that when the house was raided, right, she and her sisters would be out in the front at night, in their night clothes. And the fellows raiding them, would be looking at them. If you're a 15, 16-year-old girl, in a night dress or whatever, and there's guys there with guns, some of whom are locals, because this is County Down, and these are specials and so on. Do you see what I mean? No, she told her about sexual menace and so on, but she never said it to me. Do you see? So there's what I'm saying is in terms of memories, there's different people, I suspect, will elicit different kind of memories and so on. And it's not all about high politics, and it's not all, my study unfortunately is all about death, and that's why the horrors that the Connaught Rangers were reacting to, even though in most cases it's not of people being killed, but it's of homes being violated. It's of communities, their economies effectively being destroyed. For example, if a creamery is, I'm from Dublin, I didn't even know what a creamery was, right? But you know what a creamery is. Do you know what a creamery is in terms of its importance, right? And I think that's what we need, a plurality, not only of voices from the past, but that we need a plurality of people looking at the past, even within a single family narrative, if we're going to get a full understanding of what it was like for people, whatever their politics, whatever their role in Ireland during the War of Independence. And of course, I won't mention the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Professor, if you just wait for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. I know you have a pool of frogs in your throat and you're a champion struggling through there. But we did promise people an opportunity to ask one or two questions. Are there any questions you'd like to ask Professor O'Halpine? Yes?
Professor Halpin, you put up figures early on of numbers killed in different counties.
Yeah.
No, I hadn't time to add them up as
Yeah.
it wasn't there long. But I got figures, I wonder would they be anything nearer, that the total number killed in the War of Independence was 2,141. Of those, the British Army and the RIC, there was 776. IRA was 467, and civilians 898.
My figures are a bit different, but that's why there's always issues about definition and sources and things. But they wouldn't. My figures wouldn't be that much off yours. My total now is 2,338. That includes a huge number. The headline things for my figures, the oddest things in all these, the number of fatalities I have, is 2,338, right, from 1917 to 21, but they're nearly all in the second half of 1920 onwards, is that the British military lose well over a quarter of their deaths are what the British call own goals. They lose an enormous number, far more than the IRA, in terms of mishandling weapons, for example. Now, of course, they had weapons all the time, unlike the IRA, and they had ammunition, good ammunition all the time. But they lose a huge number. I was amazed at that. Another striking figure, again, my figure is 919 for civilians. About 200 of them are in Belfast. And a lot of the time it's impossible to say who's killing who, because there's two things. There's sectarian violence. I just go and shoot down your street because you're a prod, or you shoot down mine because I'm a Tay, right? And then the military will fire just indiscriminately to clear the streets. So it's really hard in Antrim most of the time to tell who's responsible for what kind of killings, except we know the IRA killed relatively very little. We know that very few policemen, there's about 13 RIC men is all that die, of whom about 7 maybe are actually killed by the IRA. So what I'm saying is, in different parts of the country, what's striking about the figures when you break them down is the variety of kinds of death and responsibility for death. I mean, I was in Wexford recently. I have 23 deaths in Wexford, 1917 to 21, including, I think, 7 IRA deaths, 6 of which are accidental explosions. 5 in one place in Salt Mills, 1 Seamus Rafter in 1918, that's 6. And I can't remember what other IRA fatality there was. This is up to December 21. The last death in my study is a man called Michael Bacran. Has anyone heard of him? Sligo, that's right. Yeah, he's killed in an accidental shooting and you see, that's not surprising, because by December 21, the IRA are carrying weapons because they're not having to hide them, and they have more weapons than they did, and so on. And he's killed in an accidental shooting. I think a shot goes through the ceiling of. Were they having a party? I didn't know that. Yeah, I knew it was New Year's Eve. I should have, I suppose, being Sligo, what would you expect? But it is interesting, the IRA, in terms of accidental deaths, are far fewer than Crown forces. The other thing, just on accidental deaths, the IRA have almost no deaths from traffic accidents, because they don't have any vehicles until the truce. There's two after the truce, because the IRA aren't driving around, whereas Crown forces are belting around. You think our roads are bad now, but they're belting around, particularly in dangerous areas, high speed, in lorries or cross-sea tenders or whatever. And so they lose quite a few in what we call in road accidents or whatever. So there's all sorts of different. Sligo's interesting as well, because a lot of counties with relatively small numbers of deaths, you're going to get a few inverted commas spies killed, right? But as far as I can remember, there's one person, a man called Walker, who's a process server, which means he serves bills, and they were very unpopular throughout the country. Served summonses. I think he's 71. He's killed as a spy, but I can't think of another December 21 in Sligo. Whereas in Wexford, out of 23, there are 4 civilians killed as alleged spies, and there's a 5th abducted from Wexford and killed across the border in Carlow. So in different parts of the country, again, there's very little sign in Sligo of sectarian killing. Right? Now, you could argue Walker, because sometimes people are killed, their religion matters in terms of their death, sometimes it doesn't, right? In other words, you can kill a Catholic or Protestant without a sectarian intent, but in the case, certainly of the Protestant community, I think most killings of Protestant civilians are interpreted as sectarian, even if that wasn't. Do you see what I mean? Even if that wasn't the intention. There's a man who collects dog licenses in Wexford who's robbed of the proceeds. He's an active member of the Church of Ireland and so on. He's robbed by 2 guys. There's a scuffle. He gets shot. Now, I'm certain almost that his community felt he was targeted because he was Protestant. In fact, he's targeted because he's a local official collecting the money. Do you see what I mean? Sorry, yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, Ewan, when you're well away there. Can I ask you
Oh, hi.
very quick questions? Hello.
That's Heather Ruskin.
Could I ask you, first of all, oh, would I stand up? Yes, sorry. Could I ask you, first of all, just 2 quick questions. What were the demographics of the Punjab at the time? For example, you mentioned the Connaught Rangers being one of the regiments. How many were there, and how many Indian regiments were there? So what sort of population were they controlling, the demographics, if you like? And the second question is, when did the Irish state take over paying the pensions of those people who were career soldiers? Thank you.
Well, I can answer the second question. I think it's 1936, there's legislation, and I think there might have been 2 pieces of legislation in relation to the Connaught Rangers specifically, right? And they didn't so much take over because the others had lost their pension whenever once they're convicted, the Crown is no longer giving them anything except hard labour, No, then they're released in early 23, but they're not given. They don't get an army pension because they've been mutineers, and the legislation ultimately comes back. They start pressuring in the late 20s for that they should be compensated by the Irish state. The legislation actually comes out. You can correct me, folks. I think it's 1936, and there might be a second act. As to the deployments in the Punjab, I don't want to take steal Mario's thunder, since he probably knows that I can't think of it offhand.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
May not be relevant. I think it is relevant to what you're talking about, and I'd like to know your views on it. We talk about the economics of people joining the British Army from Ireland, who needed to take the King's shilling, as it was, or because it was the thing to do in families. And with tomorrow being Remembrance Sunday, and Irish people are reluctant to wear the poppy, I was just wondering, would it be a good time that perhaps it's time for Ireland to get its own symbol, whether it be a harp or a shamrock done in red, to remember the Irish people who died in the Great Wars?
Well, I wouldn't object to that at all. If I had a poppy, I'd wear it for Enniskillen, specifically. For Enniskillen in 1987. Because I think that's we may or may not have family links to the Great War or whatever, or to the Second World War, except for my half-great uncle. I don't, as far as I know, but of course I haven't checked in detail. But I do feel very strongly the Enniskillen bombing and there was a second bomb at Tullyhannon, which was in a parade ground where two bands assembled, including a boys' brigade band, and I think a girls' brigade band. Now, that didn't go off, but if that had gone off, think of it, that would have been targeting young Protestant youth. The Enniskillen bomb was basically targeting the likes of us. And I would wear a poppy for that. Any Sinn Féin Ardèche I was invited to.
And it's dedicated, it's a shamrock. Sorry, Mary. Sorry.
All right.
It was designed specifically by the Royal British Legion to remember those who died in the Great War. Oh, okay. And it's the Taoiseach wears it. The current Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, was the first Taoiseach to actually wear it the last few years, and he is wearing it again this year. It's a shamrock with the poppy in the centre, and it's specifically for those Irishmen and women who died in the Great War.
Although it brings the question of whether we, in terms of framing, having framed these kind of things as the decade of commemoration, whether we shouldn't find an emblem to commemorate everybody who dies relating to both to the Great War and also to the War of Independence and the Civil War. I mean, I'm a bit concerned about the Civil War because one of the great narratives. In fact, does anyone remember a Tory MP called Jill Knight? She was a kind of a poor man's Margaret Thatcher from Edgbaston. She was a very right-wing whatever. But she gets up in the House of Commons after the Birmingham bombings, to be fair, and she says, look what the Irish did in the end when they had to do it in 1923. They took 77 people into Dublin Castle and they killed them in one day. The point, Jill Knight, who would not be plugged into Irish culture in Birmingham, but she knew the magic number of 77, which is the number traditionally used as the number of people executed by Free State forces during the Civil War, including 4 without any form of trial who'd been captured at the Four Courts, right? And that's the 77 for my generation was a powerful figure. For you young people, you probably don't remember it, but it was one of the figures and numbers in Irish history. It's actually, arguably, should be 81. But nobody has ever counted the number of people killed by Republican civilians, supposedly after court-martial, although they mightn't have taken place, as alleged spies. And I'll finish here. I'll give an example. I was down in the Glen of Aherlow years ago speaking at the site of an ambush which my grandfather was involved in, at Lisfernan or Lisnagall. And on the way there, the 2 old fellas who had invited me said, oh, you see that bend in the road? There was a fella shot there called Tommy Brennan in October 1922, and there used to be a cross to him. And I wasn't really listening. I said, oh, yeah? He said, yeah, he was shot as a spy. And one of them said, you know, and I heard to the day they died, my mother and father would argue as to whether Tommy Brennan should have been shot, right? But the point is, people like that killed as civilians, or there's 2 soldiers up here, but visiting their families who were dragged out, one of the 10 kids, and killed by the IRA. They too, we should count them just as much as we should count the 77. That's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor O'Halbina, for a very informative paper, and I'm sure you enjoyed that, and thanks for the questions from the floor as well. Our next speaker has travelled the furthest, I believe. We're delighted to have him here today. And Dr. Mario Draper, he's Professor of Modern History at Kent University. Mario has a very broad research interest that includes British, Irish and European military history of the 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the publications to date that he has brought forward is Mutiny Under the Sun, the Connaught Rangers, India, 1920. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Mario Draper. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me over. I'm indeed coming all the way from Canterbury in the southeast of England. It's been a lovely couple of days so far in the west of Ireland. Absolutely beautiful place. So I don't want to be the Brit who comes over here and tells you how to commemorate your fallen heroes, but I'm going to just give you a slight alternative view to how I see the Connaught Rangers mutiny unfolding in 1920. For although I believe politics very much played a part in instigating it, a lot of the blame for how it developed and then later how the sort of a lot of political myth gets woven into the narrative actually comes from poor officer-man relations and poor leadership on the part of the British officers in charge of the battalion at the time. So, starting with this, on the 5th of July 1920, the Times published this article entitled "Tampering with the Army, Sinn Féin in India." And it recounted the course of events which saw, depending on who you read, plus or minus 300 men of the 1st Battalion of the Connaught Rangers stationed at Jullundur and Solon taking part in an active mutiny, 61 of whom were tried by courts martial. Again, figures seem to vary on that. 63 I've seen, 69, 88 on the banner. But 61 that I've found tried by courts martial, 14 sentenced to death, of which only James Joseph Daly had his sentence carried out on the morning of the 2nd of November 1920. And for the British Army and the British establishment, this is a really significant event, as Ewan alluded to, because there are other things happening at the same time, which means that this event, which could have just been a localized incident, had the potential to be something much bigger. So this comes in the wake of the Amritsar massacre in April of 1919, which Ewan's already spoken about, but also back home in Britain, the demobilization strikes of 1919, which sees huge numbers, 50,000 plus British servicemen basically going to the government and demanding their immediate release from military service, which then gets tied into a whole narrative about Bolshevist infiltration into the British Army. And there are some interesting parallels there that I'll come back to. But this had the potential to strike at the very core of British rule in the empire, British rule in India, not least because it harps back, the word mutiny in India dating back to 1857 with the Indian Mutiny itself, is a really kind of inflammatory term. So this definitely had the potential to be much bigger than perhaps it actually was. And a lot of this story, this narrative, then gets tied into the role of James Daly himself, because he is the one man, as I said, who gets executed. And as a result, he gets portrayed as the ringleader, the instigator. There's all sorts of stories floated around that this is part of a premeditated Sinn Féin attack on the British Empire, that Daly is coordinating this, is key in this, and we have to remember that Daly himself wasn't actually spurred into action until 2 days after the mutiny at Jullundur had begun. So we just have to be a little bit careful about what we believe about the political narrative that is constructed around Daly after that. And a lot of these stories perpetuate. So, there's an article in The Independent by Fergal Keane sort of demanding or asking for us to pardon James Daly and, the mutineers all told. And, in many ways, this is a hugely tragic event that sees a young man lose his life, that sees the remainder scarred by their experiences in British detention and also having witnessed the execution of Daly himself. But, there are narratives here that basically, are a little bit overly egged, in my opinion, which go along the lines of these are Irishmen who are torn between their heart and their head, serving for the British army, but deep down being true loyal Irish Republicans, and there may be a modicum of truth in that, but a lot of these men enlisted in the British Army after 1916, enlisted after 1918. We have to be just a little bit careful about what we say and think. But this is pretty much the view that was taken by the Free State government upon the release of the Connaught Rangers in 1923 and later. So they set up a committee to look into the possibility of giving them compensation for their actions. And the committee's report returned this verdict. It said that the committee is satisfied from the evidence at their disposal that the mutiny had its origin in a desire on the part of the men concerned to protest against the condition of affairs existing in Ireland at the time, and that the protest which was made was entirely spontaneous. The Connaught Rangers, on the other hand, were not serving in Ireland and were not acting under directions from, nor because of any appeal from, nor association with those who were conducting affairs in Ireland. And as a result, when defending this verdict a few years later, Ernest Blythe said that in the case of the mutiny, patriotism was an afterthought. So this is the Free State government looking into the event and saying that it is not on a par with some of the protest action in Ireland at the time, and therefore these men do not warrant compensation. Because if we start handing out compensation to every Tom, Dick and Harry who suggested that they were, at the heart of, the War of Independence or Civil War, anything like that, then, basically the coffers would run dry very quickly. So they were almost the forgotten men as a result. Commemorating Gael had secured a political victory by securing their release, but once that was done, they were perfectly happy to wash their hands of the situation. So, although politics clearly played a part, and certainly was the reason that the initial mutineers, the 5 men who presented themselves at the guardroom, declared themselves to be in sympathy with Ireland, and the reason that they grounded arms, in my opinion, right, this was not a premeditated strike. This was a spontaneous reaction, probably a result of news reaching them from back home. But that rather than use this kind of political narrative, we should turn it on its head a little bit and look at it from 2 different angles. So my research or my take on things is that there are other reasons on top of the political reasons that caused a breakdown in discipline in this battalion. Firstly, institutional failings in the post-war British Army, so this is related to demobilisation, which I'll come back to. And secondly, very poor officer-man relations that weren't able, therefore, to contain this breakdown in discipline and actually allowed it to mushroom very much out of control. So, no talk would be complete without reference to Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, who is not usually thought of as being a very prescient man or very forward-thinking in his ideas. But it's interesting to note that on the 4th of October 1917, he was already thinking about the potential problems facing the British Army as a result of demobilisation. So he said that immediately hostilities cease, we must prepare for a general relaxation of the bonds of discipline. Men's minds, energies and thoughts will no longer be occupied by the task of defeating and destroying the enemy, but will trend naturally towards early return home, the establishment or reconstruction of business or other kindred matters. Hence, as soon as demobilisation commences, a feeling of jealousy will arise. Men will keenly watch the departure of others and will institute comparisons as to their respective claims. There will be generally an unsettled state, and as the natural consequences of a prolonged and arduous war, nerves will be in an irritable and unstable condition. We have, therefore, to realise that the temper of the troops during this period will be a factor not to be lightly disregarded, but it must equally be recognised that this state of mind is natural and only to be expected. And this is very much what happens. Like I say, a huge number of serving British soldiers mutiny in 1919, 1920, demanding release from the British Army. They march on Whitehall. There's problems with even the most loyal, of what you'd imagine to be the most loyal of regiments, and the Guards regiments at Purbright Camp. There's problems over in the Middle East. There's all sorts of issues going on here. And the British Army effectively does not deal with the end of the First World War particularly well. Demobilisation causes significant problems at the officer level and the NCO level, where a good number of men leave but also, and importantly, a good number of men stay, and they're not always the best quality officers and NCOs that remain in the regiment, and this can then have a dislocating effect. And this is particularly the case for the Connaught Rangers, and I date a lot of the problems in 1920 back to its experience in the First World War. So here we've got a couple of images of the 5th Battalion serving in Gallipoli. I don't know if any of you have read the regimental histories, but they're effectively compiled by the man in the centre, in the bottom right-hand corner, Lieutenant Colonel HFN Jourdain. His nephew, Jourdain, is the adjutant for the Connaught Rangers in one of the battalions in 1919, and he's got some very interesting views that you can listen to on the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive as to what happens in the mutiny. But the reason I bring this up is that the 5th Battalion and the 6th Battalion Connaught Rangers have a much harder time of it during the war. Their casualty figures are much greater than the 1st Battalion due to where they're fighting. So the 5th Battalion, particularly in Gallipoli, the 6th Battalion, particularly on the Somme. The 1st Battalion spends much of the war in the less intense theatre over in Mesopotamia, and is actually, rather strangely, amalgamated with the 2nd Battalion, which has its own questionable disciplinary record in 1914 in the retreat from Mons, when officers leave their men to be captured by the Germans, and they're not entirely sure of the strength of this unit, so they just kind of put the two regular battalions together. But as a result, the regular battalions, the pre-war battalions, retain a lot more of that pre-1914 spirit of discipline and morale, because their officers are predominantly pre-1914 regular officers, whereas the casualties sustained and the quick raising of the service battalions, the 5th and 6th battalions, sees an influx of temporary commissions and officers that had not been with the regiment or not been in the British Army as officers before the war. So if you just do a quick kind of breakdown of the officers serving in the regular and service battalions, you can see that throughout the war, the regular battalions largely maintain their pre-war composition, in terms of at least the number of military men, the clergy, professionals, whereas the service battalions rely a lot more and increasingly more on professionals, artisans and others, so those of a lower social standing. And this has an impact on how the battalions work, because war is a very dislocating experience. It's a very intense experience, and particularly under combat conditions, there is an understanding that develops between officers and their men. And particularly once the British Army moves over to being more of a citizen army, through the raising of its service battalions and eventually the introduction of conscription, those bonds between officers and men undergo another shift, where regular standards can't be imposed on a service battalion quite as easily, right? There has to be some kind of leniency, some kind of give and take. And so as soon as the war ends and the service battalions are disbanded, or in this case the 5th Battalion becomes the 2nd Battalion again, a lot of the regular officers from the pre-war who served in the 1st Battalion, the less intense theatres, remain in post, and a lot of the rank and file is comprised of a mixture of men, but many of whom served in service battalions throughout the war, particularly in the Connaught Rangers 5th and 6th Battalions. So their expectations of what officer-man relations should look like and what their officers feel officer-man relations should look like are somewhat different. So with that in mind, why did the mutiny occur? Well, Anthony Babington has suggested that the majority of the mutineers were green recruits, unaccustomed to military life, let alone military life in India. And he says this, that out of the 206 men who joined the regiment from the last two drafts, 172 joined the mutiny at Jullundur. However, just because they are new to India does not mean they are new soldiers entirely. So the 61 men I found tried by courts-martial, it's evident that the ringleaders are actually pretty seasoned veterans. So 30 of them had spent 5 or more years in the army, 6 had spent more than 4, 8 had spent more than 3, 3 had spent more than 2, 4 had spent over a year, and 10 were unidentifiable. So I don't believe that this happened because the recruits themselves were green. In fact, JWC Francis, 19th Hussars, and the last surviving witness of the courts-martial proceedings equally disregarded this argument, and he stated that beyond the mitigating circumstances of the hot weather that you would ordinarily find in India, that the reasons for the mutiny were as follows. Unrest in Ireland, letters from home, so the two obviously linked, very poor discipline, indeed of the entirely unintelligent sort, and extremely bad relations between officers and their men. Now, as I've alluded to, officer-man relations in the Connaught Rangers suffered from a unique set of circumstances caused by the First World War. So, as I said, a division of experience between the regular and the service battalions. Also, the way it was subsequently reformed under the demobilisation and then remobilisation of the British Army, which saw a regular cadre of officers and a largely sort of service battalion quota of rank and file, and then a distinctly top-heavy composition. Now, what I mean by that is that while the battalion, 1st Battalion, was refitting at the Shaft Barracks in Dover in 1919 after the war, it was noted that they had 5 majors when an ordinary regiment might only have had 3 or 4. By contrast, whereas an average unit serving overseas, average battalion would have 6 captains, the Connaughts had just 3. So they had a disproportionate high number of majors and very few captains. Now, FWS Jourdain, the nephew of the former CEO of the 5th Battalion, claimed that this was the main reason for the breakdown of discipline, as officers were too detached from the men under their command and therefore didn't know of the unrest or the unsettling effect that the unrest in Ireland was having, nor indeed did they know of how much the battalion was worried about shipping out to India, because that's no kind of easy thing to get your head around. And one of the other things he said, which is quite interesting, is that directly when we got back to 1919, we went back to 1940. Now, this is a reference to the British Army getting back to real soldiering, right? Soldiering for the British Army is not, fighting major wars. It's about, imperial service abroad, and as a result, you need a particular type of officer in charge, capable of doing this. Now, in terms of officer-man relations, then. Brigadier C.I. Gerard of the 51st Sikh Regiment, who was one of which was one of the units stationed in and around the Punjab at the time, mentioned that there was a particularly poor impression given off by the Connaughts every time that they met. So he said that we played a lot of football against the Rangers, but their officers were never present and their teams were run by NCOs. We gained the impression that the officers were not in close touch with their men. Now, this is at a time when officers and rank and file were expected to share the field to build kind of esprit de corps in the sort of British regimental identities kind of system. More worrying was Gerard's impression that senior and junior officers didn't see eye to eye either, stating that subalterns appeared to have a chip on their shoulder and much to say against their colonel and their adjutant, which was not good, especially to an outsider like myself. So it revealed a potentially serious problem in the structure and the ethos of the post-war British Army, and how it hadn't really come to terms with its reorganisation after the First World War. And if it could happen in one regiment, it could foreseeably happen in another, which is why I think that the British government were quite keen to take on this idea of a Sinn Féin cell in the Connaught Rangers as an idea for explaining away the mutiny, because that they could suggest was just an isolated incident which they had dealt with. The fact that other regiments in the British Army might equally suffer from poor officer-man relations as a result of an oversight in demobilisation could have been potentially more problematic. Now, the 1st Battalion Connaught Rangers seem also to have suffered from poor quality officers whose inabilities were exposed by the travails of imperial service, and particularly then by the mutiny. So the adjutant, LWL leader, was said to be sly and untrustworthy, never a good thing. he was neither loved nor trusted by anyone. And so when the 200 men appeared outside the officers' mess at Jullundore on the 28th of June to express their concerns, to Colonel Deacon, Private Scanlon reportedly targeted leader for abuse, claiming that he would knock his block off for having punished him with several months' detention for an earlier incident. Deacon himself was described as being a great bully, who ticked off senior officers in front of the juniors, and what was worse, officers in front of the men. Captain Leslie Badham, up at Solon, was equally disliked, particularly when he cancelled the men's day off in favour of running a musketry course the day before the mutiny. So all these things start to come together, in my mind at least, as demonstrating a pretty poor dynamic within the regiment. So whereas the problems within the Connaught Rangers were a result of a post-First World War structural hangover, there were other reasons also involved that chipped away at good officer-man relations. Namely, the fact that a lot of these officers still in charge were uninspiring individuals. So Major Payne was rarely seen sober after 6 o'clock. I can relate to that. Whilst Majors Nolan, Farrell, Lloyd and Truell were described respectively as having no imagination, not a particularly distinguished officer, and one of those majors who never really seems to get beyond that. So not really a ringing endorsement. Though it should be said that Truell was in charge of A Company up at Juketor, which actually remained loyal, so at least there's something there. Colonel Deacon and Major Alexander were subsequently accused of mishandling the mutiny, with the former being relieved of his command on the 29th of June for dithering, and Alexander was severely reprimanded afterwards for his failure to control events up at Solon. So, by way of conclusion, what can I say? Well, I believe that it's a combination of both incompetence on the part of the officers, but also an adherence to pre-First World War methods and understanding of discipline and morale that caused the mutiny to spiral out of control. That you had very strong characters involved in the likes of Daly, who could take a situation like that by the scruff of the neck and turn it from what might have been dealt with by better officers in a more in a better way, in a quieter way, but this kind of mushrooms out of their control. But beyond the fact that you have incompetent officers, you also have this structural hangover from demobilisation after the First World War that is looming over the entirety of the British Army. I mean, there's a phrase in there that the officer called, there was an embarrassing surplus of officers and they didn't really know what to do with many of them, which doesn't paint a particularly good picture. Nevertheless, we shouldn't completely erase the idea that events in Ireland were certainly playing on the men's minds, but I think we have to be careful about overstating this fact. Certainly when you get beyond the mutiny itself in subsequent years, it gets tied up with all sorts of other narratives to do with, I've seen things suggesting that the mutiny happened in 1916 so that they could tie it in with the Easter Rising, the whole Black and Tans thing, the very emotive subject of the Black and Tans, that becomes increasingly prevalent in the mutineers' own description of events that actually their initial testimonies to the court of inquiry back in India mentions it barely ever. But this, with the changing political climate, becomes more and more acceptable and allows them, at least in 1936 with De Valera, to access those pension funds that they were so long after. But crucially, from my perspective at least, one thing we can say, it was not a premeditated strike by Sinn Féin on British rule in India. Actually, this narrative helped both the mutineers get into the 30s to achieve what they wanted in terms of financial recompense, but it also helped the British paper over much bigger cracks in their military organisation after the First World War. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor. A very interesting paper, and again, we'll just have time for about 2 questions because we want to break for a comfort break and a bit of finger food outside. So we'll give just 2 questions to the audience.
I agree that Badham, who lost his eye during the war, and Payne were originally two good officers, but traumatised by the war, they became alcoholics, and therefore could, if they'd been any better, have nipped that thing in the bud, because they were the first officers on call at the time. I have another reason that I think the mutiny was caused by something else. Daly and Golgotty, one of the four original mutineers, were both in the army at the end of the war, didn't fight in the war, they enlisted in the war. They got, they left the army in 1919 and re-enlisted, both on the same day in an army camp at Rugeley in the Midlands in England. I feel that they were planted there by someone unknown. It's just too much of a coincidence that these two men became the leading lights in something that happened a few thousand miles away a few months later.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I have not come across any evidence that would make me think that it was a premeditated strike. A lot of this comes from the question marks over the flag and the rosettes that they wore once they'd laid down their arms, and you know, apart really from Joseph Hoare's testimony, I think in was it 1949 or 1963 one of them, he suggests that those items were unaccounted for. The rest very clearly state that they went down to the local bazaar and paid for these things to be made, and you know, it wasn't as if these things were brought with them from the UK and Ireland. And so as a result of that, you know, sort of misleading statement by Joseph Hoare's, there's been a lot made of the fact that these items were brought with them, and therefore it must have been some kind of premeditated strike. If my other counterpoint to that would be, if it was some kind of premeditated strike, how come it was only in one battalion of one Irish regiment in the British Army and not wider spread? So there was some concern that the first Royal Irish Regiment was full of Sinn Féin at the time, but nothing much came of it. They did an audit effectively of other Irish units and didn't really find anything to suggest that they were particularly worried about a sort of Sinn Féin strike. So again, why just one battalion? Why just a couple of companies of one battalion? And if it was so well coordinated, how come it took 2 days for, you know, the Drillendale Mutiny to spring up in Solon? Why wasn't it all, you know, orchestrated and timed to happen at the same time? But that's just my take.
I agree with you in relation to the bad officers, because it was also said after the mutiny that the proper procedure to have been followed would have been to get Sergeant Major Morahan, who was out in the fields on rifle training duties, and get him back, because he was the man that liaises between the officers and the men, and he's the man that could have solved the problem. Now, James Daly never served in the First World War, and he came in, and a lot of the other mutineers, not the majority of them now, but a lot of them, came into the Connaught Rangers from other regiments after the war. So they weren't, as my grandfather used to say, part of the family.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's, you know, one of the things, isn't it? But, you know, from my perspective, you know, where these men are coming in from, they're coming in from, you know, other regiments in the Great War that had fought, you know, in various places. And like I say, for my argument of officer-man relations, there's an expectation. You know, David Englander, historian of the First World War, has talked about this changing relationship where men in service battalions in particular, or those men who had undergone very strenuous fighting, became very keen judges of their officers, right? And although obedience was unconditional, right, in reality they could negotiate much better than those from regular battalions. So yeah, this influx from outside could have contributed in that respect as well.
Professor Draper, thanks very much for a most enlightening paper.
Our next speaker is associated with the Connaught Rangers. He's a historian for the Connaught Rangers, and We have had great cooperation in when we were doing exhibitions in our museum service for World War I exhibitions and that. And we've got great cooperation with memorabilia given on loan to the museum in Sligo. And I'd like to thank Danny and his people in the Connaught Rangers Historical Association for helping us out. Danny comes from a military family himself. His father was one of the Jattaville heroes who served with A Company, 35th Battalion in the Congo in 1961. His grandfather served the 1st Battalion Connaught Rangers from 1897 until 1922, seeing service during the Boer War and the First World War. Danny himself served with the FCA, retiring in 2010 with the rank of Commandant. Danny has studied the history of the Connaught Rangers and in particular the mutiny of the Connaught Rangers in India. So without any further ado, I'd like you to welcome Danny Tiernan. Thank you.
Members of the famous mutinous family, welcome. President Chamber of Commerce, fellow speakers, welcome. If Dr. O'Halpine didn't put you to sleep, I guarantee you I will. And as they used to say on a certain radio programme one time, if you do feel like singing, well, if you do feel like snoring, snore an Irish snore. Thank you. If you were to be shot, stick up for your Irish home, which is ruined by the troops of our dear country. It is your duty to fight now and to try and make her free once more. That was the notice that was put up on the mantelpiece in Wellington Barracks, in the library mantelpiece in Wellington Barracks on the 27th of June 1920. Nobody has ever owned up as to who put it up, and nobody knows who did. But it was obviously something to do with Hawes, Gogarty, Lally, the three men that got together in Jalunder on that particular night and started to talk about the atrocities that were happening in Ireland. But I'm not going to deal with the mutiny as such. I will mention it from time to time. I'm going to deal with what happened to them when they came back and how they were treated by the Irish Free State as it was then. The following day after that notice went up, a group of Irish soldiers downed tools in protest against action of their fellow soldiers and the British government at that time in Ireland. But what effect would those actions have on the soldiers who took action in the mutiny later on when they arrived back? They were released in August 1922 and in January 23 onwards and repatriated to Ireland almost immediately. The struggle to survive is a natural instinct in us all. Excuse me. And when men of the Connaught Rangers were released in 1922, the regiment had been disbanded and under the recommendations of the Geddes Committee. In February 1922, Warrington Evans announced in the House of Commons that the King had approved the disbandment of the 6 Irish regiments. But from 1919 until 1922, a number of Irish soldiers continued to join the British Army. The Connaught Rangers got in 1,921 people. The Leinster Regiment got 1,713. The Royal Irish, 1,650. The Royal Munsters, 1,595. The Royal Dubs, 1,613, giving us a total of 848 people who still joined the British Army. And you will note from those figures that the Connaught Rangers got the greatest amount, got the largest amount, because they were still treated as a regiment, a proud regiment and a good fighting regiment and a regiment to be with. They were a brotherhood of regiments. Sorry. The order allowed for the disbandment of the Irish regiments, also allowed for the recruitment of men into the British Army. The men who mutinied had one other problem to face. The soldiers who returned home the soldiers who returned home after disbandment were also looking for work. Jobs were scarce and the welfare system only came into being in 1944. But the mutineers were destitute and in some cases living rough. Johnny McGowan from Boyle, where I come from, is one who comes to mind. The option of going back into the British Army was gone, so the only thing that Johnny could do was come home and look for a job in Ireland, but he wasn't going to get
what would we say, a high-ranking job. There were problems as some of the ex-Connaught Rangers had already joined the Free State Army and knew the mutineers, so they didn't want them in either. They didn't want them in the same battalions as they were in. Another factor that mitigated other factors that helped exclude the mutineers from walking into jobs was the fact that most of the large employers were from mainly Protestant and Loyalist communities. They still felt aggrieved that they were let down by the treaty and the introduction of Home Rule in 1922. So to employ the men who had been disloyal to the Crown would have been disloyal. So rose an element of trust in one such company. So rose the element of trust if one such company was to employ them. Also, these men were broken, in some cases suffering from medical conditions that they received while they were in prison in Maidstone and the other prisons. All these factors mitigated against any of them getting any type of meaningful employment and being able to hold such positions. The Minister for Finance had declared that, in the case of the Connaught Rangers, that the government had offered immediate establishment in the National Army to any released Connaught Ranger who was medically fit. Now, there was very few of them medically fit to go into anything. They were all starved, they were hungry, they had picked up diseases, and they were not medically fit to join an army. Some were accepted into the Irish Army, some got jobs as labourers, while a few set up their own businesses. Some of those who got jobs struggled to hold on to them for long periods of time, while others moved from job to job. They'd work for a week or two here, a week or two there. During the setting up of the Free State and the agreement made with Britain in relation to ex-civil servants and their security and related pensions upon retirement, as well as the oath of allegiance, was to place the government of Cosgrove in an awkward position in relation to the released mutineers. The release was tied to a number of factors, one being that there would be no show of favouritism, glory or heroics to the released men. So the fight to gain any kind of recognition or reward was in their own hands. In other words, there was nobody standing up waving a flag or a banner for them. John Flannery started a campaign in Dublin to have the men rewarded by way of pensions and enumerations of some sort. In the summer of 1924, handbills, and there's a copy over there on the wall, handbills appeared on the walls of Dublin and other towns seeking support for the mutineers. But it must be pointed out that public attention during the 1920s was sustained by ex-mutineers who lived in Dublin. So most of the campaign was carried on in Dublin. Guys that came to rural Ireland, back to rural Ireland, got very little support from anyone. Connaught Rangers who grounded arms in India in June 1920 as a protest against the ill treatment of people in Ireland by black and tans are now cast adrift without any provision being made for them. Jailed by the British government, cast aside by the people of Ireland, Irishmen, is this your return for their manly action? Look out for public meetings, communications to be addressed to the Secretary, ex-Connaught Rangers Committee, 35 Garner Street, Dublin. That's where Flannery lived. Flannery used his own address. Flannery, who was seen as a traitor by the mutineers, because what happened getting back, when the mutiny started, Flannery was with them. But when Flannery saw the way things were going and what was going to happen, Flannery had a good idea of military law, and he knew that there was going to be repercussions. He knew that they were going to be thrown out. He knew that they were going to be dealt with severely. So he changed sides, and he made himself out to be a go-between between the British establishment, the officers, and the men. The men saw this as Flannery turning tail. The committee never used the word mutiny. The committee always used the word grounding of arms. Flannery was about to obtain support and enlisted the following prominent organisations: the Council for the Unemployed, the President of the Tenants Association, and members of the Gaelic League. All rode in behind Flannery. On the 27th of August 1924, Flannery organised a mass meeting in O'Connell Street to protest at the way in which the mutineers were being treated by the Free State government. One member of the Gaelic League said, "The stand made in India by the Connaught Rangers in hostile surroundings will rank as one of the most glorious episodes in Ireland's fight for freedom." At the end of the demonstration, a resolution was passed with unanimous approval, which declared, "This mass open-air meeting of Dublin citizens hereby register emphatic protest against the treatment which has been muted out to the men of the Connaught Rangers, who so gallantly stood for Ireland in India and in protest against the Black and Tans in 1920. And we urge by demanding that the authorities at once come to the assistance of these men by raising them from want, misery and starvation, as it is a scandal that bravery and chivalry be so treated." Flannery distributed the motion to the President, Mr. Cosgrove, Tim Healy, the Governor-General of the Irish Free State, and the British Prime Minister. He also sent them to Annie Smith, brother of Private Smith, who was killed by accident during the charge on the magazine at Solon. Now, Private Smith had nothing to do with the mutiny. Private Smith was coming, he was coming from the wet canteen. Wet canteen is where you could get alcohol. Dry canteen is where you got tea, coffee, and whatever. And he was coming up across, the magazine was on top of a hill, and there was three roads leading up to it. One from the messes, two from, the second road was coming from the officers' quarters, and the third road came up from where the huts were, where the men slept. And he was making his way back. It was a shortcut back when he was accidentally shot during Daly's charge on the magazine. So there should have been, he should never have been in the situation where he would have to go looking for money. He should have automatically, his family should automatically have been paid by the British government for the accidental shooting. But he wrote to Annie Smith, and he got her to pass out leaflets on his behalf. And she also apologised for not being able to attend the meeting in Dublin. She said she was single and looking after her ill father. It must be said at this juncture that the British should have, as I said earlier, paid compensation to Smith. Flannery had on numerous occasions tried to get a meeting with the government representatives to discuss the case, but to no avail. The problem the government had was trying to decide which department should be best suited to dealing with the complaint. Flannery was getting impatient, and after receiving no response for some time, he went to the President, he sent a letter to the President, and getting no result from that, he started on the Minister for Justice. The Minister was the chairman of the committee which had investigated the claims for compensation made by dismissed or retired members of the RIC, who were replaced by An Garda Síochána. On the 19th of September, Flannery wrote to the Minister on behalf of the ex-Connaught Rangers Committee, and he said, "Dear Sir, a deputation of 4 has been selected by our committee to wait on you on Monday the 22nd instant, at the hour of 12 o'clock noon, for the purpose of laying our case before you orally and seeking your help in having something definite done for the men of the Connaught Rangers, who did noble work for Ireland and India in 1920. It is unnecessary to point out that the matter is now hanging on a long time and should be considered and finally disposed of." Now, anyone know, you don't send a letter to a minister telling them he's going to meet you. He sends a letter to you telling he's going to meet you. But Flannery was a bit cheeky, and for that reason, I firmly believe that there was another force behind Flannery. There was somebody else pushing his case, because I don't believe that Flannery would have had the wherewithal. Now, I don't know the man, I never met the man, but from looking at his writings and readings, I don't think he would have had the wherewithal to actually have the gall to write to a minister and tell him, "I'm meeting you," you know, when I'm ready. But anyway, however, the Minister for Justice did not intend to be pressurised by John Flannery into authenticating the claim put forward by the mutineers. Indeed, there seemed to be evidence among the government departments in Dublin to assume a primary responsibility in the matter. Flannery received a prompt and courteous reply to his letter, informing him that the Minister for Justice had ascertained from the President's Department that they were going to arrange to see a deputation from the committee during the course of the following week. The Minister had asked the Department to communicate with Flannery to arrange an appointment as soon as possible. And in the circumstances, it seemed unnecessary for a deputation from the Connaught Rangers to visit the Minister for Justice on the following Monday. A deputation was met by the Minister's Secretary, Mr. Seamus Dolan. Now, Dolan took a very prominent part in looking after the Rangers, or putting forward their case after this. But anyway, at the government buildings on the 24th of September 1923, Flannery had with him two men, Mr. Frank Larkin, the President of the Tenants Association, and Mr. Dermot Stewart from the Dublin Trade Council. He then cited two examples of abject poverty in which some of the mutineers with their next of kin were existing. Flannery was living in a one-room house with four other people. The Smiths of Drogheda, almost prepared to go to the workhouse. He finished by declaring that all the men should be helped immediately, and they would then become loyal citizens of the Irish Free State. Stewart said he concurred with Larkin, and that the Dublin Trade Council regarded the claim of the Connaught Rangers as being exceptional. Dolan thanked the deputation and said he would put the case to the Connaught Rangers as strongly as possible before the Executive Council of the government. Flannery then wrote to the Irish Independent on the 27th of September. He said, "Dear Sir, will you please allow me through your valuable paper to publicly notify the men of the 1920 mutiny in India belonging to the Connaught Rangers, that the government has decided to give matters of recognition to the men in practical sympathy, and it is absolutely necessary that I should have their names, addresses, service, rank, possibly the amount of pension that they continued service, and a number of their dependents. As many of my comrades are scattered, and some hold rank in the Civil Guards and the National Army. I hope you will help to get in immediate touch with them. I am in touch with a good number, but there are others who have changed their address." So Flannery was looking to compile a record of some kind that he could present to the state to get the pension. He needed names, addresses, but he was also reaching out to the people outside Dublin. Flannery needed to have a coherent, well-balanced agenda, a well-balanced force to put forward. He needed as many people as possible from the mutiny. Now remember, Flannery was seen as a coward, was seen as a turncoat by the Rangers, so a lot of them wouldn't have an awful lot to do with him. Flannery only got a response from 20 ex-Rangers. He sent a list of 21 names, including his own, to Seamus Dolan. Beside each name, he set out how many dependents and the length of service that these men had. Flannery left out three most important men who started the mutiny: Joseph Hawes, Stephen Lally and Patrick Gogarty. Now, you can imagine why he left them out. They weren't very good friends. They weren't friendly. They weren't on friendly terms. Was this a deliberate aim to leave out the men as to settle old scores? The government tried through the British Prime Minister office and the Department of Defence to get a list of each man's service. The British refused to release the information, but the British authorities were watching the whole situation closely. Flannery also added a footnote to his list. Flannery and Oliver forfeit life pensions, £30 gratuity and credit. Generally, most of the men forfeit this gratuity with their pensions, while a number forfeit disability grants, malaria, sunstroke and heart affections. The dependents of the executed and killed called for special treatment. Dolan, in fairness to him, made a recommendation to, to the Minister, and he wrote, "The total number of men involved is 52, and from the letter I have received and the statements made by the deputation, I am satisfied that a good proportion of them are in very bad circumstances. In fact, as members of the deputation stated, in dire want. In addition to the 52 men mentioned above, there are dependents of the 3 men who lost their lives. Dolan admitted to having some difficulty in suggesting the best way in which the matter should be dealt with. He believed that the mutineers should get some help, as most of them had forfeited gratuities, credits, and some had lost life pensions. I would suggest, he went on, that by way of immediate relief for the men in dire want, that the sum of £200 be made available at once. And when you have decided how far you will go, we will make a general claim. A small committee of 3 might be set up to examine the circumstances of each case. On the 16th of February 1925, Flannery turned to the President Department in Merrion Square, Dublin, without having an appointment. Sorry, he turned up. He handed in a letter addressed to Mr. Cosgrave from Mary Larkin of the Tenants Association, which stated, "Bearer John Flannery of the Connaught Rangers is in the position which calls for immediate relief. His mother's rent and other debts have accumulated, and it would be a merciful act to give him a grant of help. He waited for a reply or an interview, should it be convenient for you to see him in person." So again, you don't turn up at the minister's door and expect him to let you in and talk to you and give you money. But anyway, Flannery seemed to think that he could do that. Flannery's persistence did have some effect, as the President wrote to Ernest Bligh, the Minister for Finance. Bligh replied that the mutineers, had received some compensation, but it appeared they were not happy and with it and wanted a level of compensation that was given out to the RUC. Now, there was an agreement with the Irish Free State as it became, and the British government, that the Irish would take on the pensions of the RIC and those retired and those that left when they changed over to the An Garda Síochána, and that their pensions would follow on as part of their pension when they retired from An Garda Síochána. The President suggested that the creation of a small committee of 2 parliamentary secretaries and a minister to consider the claim of these men. He added, "I do not know whether this is the best way of dealing with the case, but in any case, the whole matter is unsatisfactory at present, going from one minister to another and to private secretaries as well." So he was getting a bit peed off with letters hopping from one person to another and the same letter going round. Mary Larkin continued to write to the President, complaining that the Connaught Rangers were living in dire poverty and something ought to be done about it. It was around this time that the Irish Independent started to publish an article on the mutiny at the Connaught Rangers, and it was written by a person who used the name One Who Knows. The article was basically Flannery's evidence to the court-martial. The article did not sit well with Cosgrave, who wanted to keep the cordial relationship that had developed between the UK and the Irish government. He didn't want to rock the boat on those. It must also be said that members of the Dáil, Mr. McDermott TD, did not think it was praiseworthy. The action of the Connaught Rangers in India, the dismissal by Mr. McDermott of the Connaught Rangers' contribution to the Irish nationalism, was debated by Mr. Donnelly, who discussed 2 different points of view taken by the Irish nationalists. There was an isolated nationalist who considered that no sort of terms should be made with the British Empire, and that we should devote ourselves to revolution. In contrast to this was the Redmondites' view, Irish nationalism, that the best way to work towards getting self-government was to accept the Crown and the Empire and to develop within that framework. The Connaught Rangers took the latter view by going into the British Army of their own free will, took an oath of allegiance in their own free will, took upon themselves the obligation of maintaining the splendid tradition of the Connaught Rangers, and yet, in spite of that, they mutinied while in the service of the Crown. Mr. O'Farrell addressed the Connaught Rangers' contribution to Irish freedom when he said the Connaught Rangers did a braver thing than anyone in this country when they mutinied. They took a risk far greater than the majority of people in this country ever faced or had to face. These plain soldiers of the British regiment risked their lives thousands of miles away from home, not knowing whether they would ever be heard of again, or cared if anyone would pity them or raise a voice in support of their dependents. And so the SAG continued with Flannery, with his begging bowl, and the Dáil trying not to offend the British government by rewarding the men of the mutiny in India in 1922. The government were considering setting up a committee of inquiry at an early date to consider the Connaught Rangers' claim of the ex-members from arising out of the mutiny. In March 1925, a committee consisting of Mr. Dolan, Diarmuid O'Hegarty, P.S. O'Hegarty, R.J. Baker, Chief Auditor of the Department of Local Government and Public Health, was established to examine claims of the Connaught Rangers for compensation from the Government of Ireland. Deputies O'Flaherty, O'Higgin, proposed that the Dáil Éireann Select Committee consist of 5 deputies, be appointed to investigate and report on the claim. The committee had the authority to send for persons, papers and records. We would adopt the same publicity tactics as was done for the committee, the claim on the British ex-servicemen through newspaper advertisements and consultation with the interested government departments or any other relative source. The terms of reference of the committee would ascertain the nature and extent of the claims from... I think you left too many frogs up here. Ex-members of the Connaught Rangers who participated in the mutiny in India in 1920, with particular reference as to whether the military service of the claimants was on a pensionable basis or a short service basis. And as for the number of those claims disability from wounds or injuries or from disease attributed to imprisonment. To get a pension, you had to have X number of years done in the army at that time. So after 5 years, you could claim a certain amount of money. But because they mutinied, those 5 years was gone. They were gone. They had lost all entitlements. B. Widows and children of ex-members of the Connaught Rangers whose death is claimed to have been due to execution, wounds or injuries sustained in the mutiny, or disease attributed to imprisonment consequent to the mutiny. The government, or at least some members, felt that the men of the Connaught Rangers who voluntarily took such action in India were in the same position as civilians who made the sacrifice for national cause at home. So in other words, they were saying that, look, people in Ireland that fought the British Army, that stood on the corner, spied on them, and that they equally did the same thing, or they were equal to what the Connaught Rangers did in India. Many civilians, their personal prospects, who had run a great risk at home in order to do what they considered they should do and ought to do in the interest of the country. And they were receiving no compensation. Many civilians made greater sacrifices from the economic point of view than perhaps any of the Connaught Rangers, whose businesses were allowed to fall into this decay because of the time given to the national affair and because of the imprisonment suffered. They had no claim to compensation. So in other words, they were saying that the Connaught Rangers weren't entitled to anything because all they had done was the same as what the ordinary civilian did at home. And so the saga went on, and there were, as far as I can remember, 6 Connaught Ranger government motions put down in relation to pensions. A lot of them, as I said earlier on, were very ill. They weren't well. I'm just looking for something here that I've mislaid. They weren't very well. And the Irish government had decided that they were going to look at what the men would have been entitled to had there been no mutiny and had they come out in 1922. And they looked at the pay structure of the Connaught Rangers at that time and what they were getting paid. And a Connaught Ranger at the time of the mutiny was being paid a rate of 25 shillings a weekly allowance of 15 shillings, and a ration allowance of 9 shillings for dependents. Allowance and 5 shillings for clothes. And in addition, they got a gratuity if they served for 4 years. They got a gratuity of £50. Reports on individuals were presented to the Dáil concerning the well-being of the Connaught Rangers mutineers. And the first one that they mentioned was James Daly. They said, James Daly, who was the only one to be shot for his part in the mutiny, left a mother who, through the representation of Mr. Shaw TD, received 2 grants from President Cosgrove, totalling £15. He gave her a £10 and then later on he gave her a £5, and was receiving a weekly pension of 5 shillings from the British Army, from the British War Office, in respect of another son who had died while in active service. James Oliver from Loughrea, County Galway, Thomas Devine from Longford, John McGowan from Boyle, and James Flannery, Dublin, were ideal and destitute. James Davis escaped from working jail and had joined the IRA. He fought the B Specials on the Spurn Mountains, and he had been recaptured and spent 5 years in Peterhead jail before his release in 1926. And he wrote, "Just to let you know I am still alive," typical Irishman. I could not go to see you on Sunday, as I had to pledge my clothes to pay the rent, and as everything in the house has been sold since I was knocked idle. I am now in a proper fix. My mother has been laid up for the last 3 weeks. I wonder what the people who appealed to us to protest against the Black and Tans are thinking about to leave us in such a destitute state. Patrick Donoghue from Cork lost his disability pension and was not fit for work as a result of wounds received in World War I. Mr. Donoghue was, in essence, completely broken and in poor health. At the time of the mutiny, Thomas Devine in Longford was sentenced to death for his part in the mutiny, commuted to penal servitude for life, imprisoned for 2.5 years. Mr. Devine was waiting to be drafted home at the time of the mutiny, but lost this by taking part in the mutiny, and afterwards got wound pension of 7 and 6pence. Prior to the mutiny, he had been granted £1 per week wound pension. He was unemployed and living with an aged father. Patrick Dyer suffered from malaria for 2 years imprisonment, living in bad circumstances with his wife and 3 children in Ballymote, Sligo. The widowed mother of J. Fallon from Drogheda was in bad health and dependent on him. After 12 years in the British Army and 2 years in prison, Mr. Fallon was unemployed and in destitute circumstances. Flannery himself, 12 years, 2 months. Flannery had an aged mother with a younger sister to look after. Thanks to the widow's sister, who was receiving £1 and 16 shillings per week compensation for a husband dying from the effects of war. We are all not starving today. After 13 years' service in the British Army, John Flannery of Dublin was unemployed with dependents, aged, invalid mother and widowed sister. Patrick Kelly, a sergeant major, who died in Manorhamilton, County Home. His prominent part resulted in penal servitude for life. His health gave way as a result of the war service. Following his transfer to the English prison, there was a non-payment of service pension. The journey between prison, Portland, Maidstone and Manchester caused Michael Cairns, 20 Middle North Court Avenue, Church Road, Dublin, to die in poverty in the South Dublin Union on Tuesday, August the 6th. With 16.5 years service in the British Army, John Oliver, a Galway man, was sentenced to death, commuted to penal servitude for life. Imprisoned for 2.5 years, Mr. Oliver was a patient in Galway Hospital and in the county home for many months. John Oliver was unemployed and in bad health, and last heard of living on 4 shillings a week, outdoor relief. William Shallow died 4 weeks after his release from Waterford Workhouse. as the result of ill treatment he had undergone in Maidstone. Shallows' death was a cruel commentary on the gratitude displayed by the so-called Irish government for his actions in India when this man came home to die in the workhouse. Johnny McGowan was slightly different to the rest of them. I had the privilege, their brother lived not too far from my mother and father lived, George, and he was a very interesting man to talk to. He didn't have much respect for John. He reckoned John was for the birds. But anyway, these are Flannery's reports now about the people. Johnny McGowan suffered from tubular throat, which he contracted in prison. John McGowan, St. Patrick Street, Boyle, County Roscommon, joined the Guards on the 21st of January 1925 and was later attached to the detective unit. In February 1925, a detective unit was sent to Drumshanbo, County Leitrim, for special duty. During a stopover in Carrick-on-Shannon, which had to be made when you go through Carrick, McGowan placed two men who were having their dinner against the wall and appeared to draw his revolver on them, under the apparent influence of alcohol. The incident was subjected to a board of inquiry, but Johnny stepped in very quick and handed in his resignation. Johnny went to America and he started working as a merchant seaman, but he was an out-and-out alcoholic. He suffered mostly from malaria, I think it was, or the after effects of malaria. And he died destitute on a ship in New York Harbour. Johnny got into America through Canada. And like all good Irish people, he made his way across the border south as an illegal immigrant. And he was about to be deported when they discovered him in the hospital. But because Johnny had got a pension from the Irish state at the time of his death, Johnny was allowed to stay in America and live on his pension. But as I said, he died on the ship and is buried in America. Francis Morden joined the Free State Army but was arrested in Sligo and discharged. He got employment at £18 a year. So ex-Connaught Rangers shouldn't go to Sligo to get a job. John Morehouse reflected on the case of the Connaught Rangers who mutinied in India. Some suffered death, others imprisoned, followed by discharge with ignominy. Despite having service in the National Army, John Morehouse from Newbridge, County Kildare, was practically starving, unemployed with a wife and 3 children. And so the story goes on and on about every one of them. Most of them, as I said, up around Dublin. Very few of them in the West stayed around. They went off, they left, went to England to work. Their lives were total misery, and the state didn't seem to be doing anything about it. De Valera, when he came into power, when he went into government with Labour in 1932, he abolished the oath of allegiance to the Crown. He discontinued the payment of interest by the Irish Free State on the capital sum advanced by Britain under the Land Purchasing Act. De Valera, I suppose, was one of the people that caught himself, because poor old Dev, during the debates on the pensions for the Rangers, the government always voted against doing anything for them, but Fianna Fáil and the Dev would always vote in favour of doing something for them, even though they never won the vote. But now in 1933, Dev is back into power after the second election, and the Connaught Rangers are putting pressure on him because he had voted in favour of everything that they wanted, or almost everything, and the Cosgrove government was voting against it. So Dev kind of found himself in a position that he had to do something. So the mood of the Dáil was now in favour, was more in favour than it had ever been for compensating the Connaught Rangers mutineers. Not only had Dev voted in favour of Frank Fahey's motion in 1930, but he had also supported Sean McAtee, who was now the Minister for Finance, and for Frank Aiken, who was the Minister for Defence. it was not long before the matter was raised again, and on the 28th of February 1934, to reply to a question in the Dáil, the government minister announced, "It is proposed to set up a committee of inquiry at an early stage to consider the claim for ex-members of the Connaught Rangers arising out of the mutiny in India. The Committee of Inquiry consisted of 3 members, was appointed on the 10th of July 1934. The terms of reference were to examine the claims for compensation made by the mutineers who had been wounded or injured during the mutiny, or had suffered financial loss through taking part in it, or had contracted illnesses attributed to prison sentences serving in connection with it. They had also to consider claims put forward by widows and children of those who were executed or who had been executed as a result of it." Well, we know there was only one man executed, and that was Daly, and he didn't have a wife and children, but he did have a mother living in Charles Pass. The committee presented its report to the Defence and Finance Ministers in June, 29th of June 1935. The Minister for Defence approved the report to the committee with the proviso that some items on the scale of compensation should be increased. It is also endorsed by the Irish Cabinet at a meeting in August 1935. The Connaught Rangers Pension Bill was introduced in the Dáil by the Minister for Defence on the 29th of April 1936 and was approved without a division after only one member, Mr Frank McDermott, had spoken in any way critical about the mutiny. McDermott, who sat as an independent, had been educated as a Roman Catholic in a school in England and had served in the Irish government during the war. He had spent some time working for a firm of bankers in New York and, and was recognised to be a man of considerable intelligence. Politically, he believed that the Irish Free State should remain part of the British Commonwealth. He was not objecting to the bill or opposing it, he said, but he did not want the public to get the view that what the mutineers did was entirely praiseworthy. In his view, it had not been praiseworthy at all. At last, the Connaught Rangers got their pension bill. They got their pensions from the state, and the amount paid was increased several times before the last of the brave mutineers passed away, and the deeds of those brave men vanished into the bygone days of yesterday. But thanks to that good lady over there, it's now been reenacted, or been it's been brought back again to life. But I'll leave the last word to Charlie Corrigan, a gentleman who I met and sat down in his house, and he made tea for me, and we chatted for hours. As a matter of fact, he was the first man to get me into trouble. I was an hour late going back to work after I'd finished talking to Charlie. But a lovely man, a man who said a lot and put me thinking and put me researching and having a look at different things from a different angle. He said, he's talking about coming home to Sligo. He said, we were taken for breakfast when we arrived from in Dublin, in a hotel in Westland Row. And there we were met by the local TD from Sligo, and later entrained for Sligo. John Scanlon arrived in Sligo. We received a welcoming drink. I later walked the 8-mile home to be greeted by my father. My mother passed away while I was in Maidstone prison. I was penniless when I arrived in Leitrim, but the villagers rallied round and gave me £10. The villagers rallied round and gave me £10. The state gave me a kick in the arse. So let's just have a quick gander over most of these guys. John Buckley, labourer in Manchester. He died in '65. William Burland died in the Royal Hospital in Donnybrook. Simon Connell was a labourer in Manchester. William Coote was a boilerman. Coleman was a general worker. Martin Conlon, a labourer. Patrick Cherry, a docker. James Daly, as we said, was shot at dawn. John Daly was a labourer in Ballinasloe. James Davis was a labourer in Donnybrook. And so on and so forth. And you think, to look at the list of these guys, they had jobs and that. But those jobs only lasted weeks. In some cases, they might work for 2 or 3 weeks and they'd end up in hospital for 5 or 6 weeks or maybe for months. And they get back in and they get a job for a while. But the way that they were treated at the end of the day by the Irish Free State, they felt aggrieved, they felt hurt and they felt angry that the deed, that what they did, and what they did could have had, the 14 of them could have been shot that were sentenced to death. They could have been shot. But James Daly was the only one to be shot. And the previous speaker mentioned James Daly and that he believed that Daly was shot for a particular reason. But I'd also add to that, I think James Daly was shot for one reason and one reason only. And the more I look into it, the more I'm convinced that James Daly died because Sears and Smythe were shot that day, that fateful evening, going up to the magazine. I think that's the only reason Daly was shot. Because somebody had to be punished. And the only way to punish somebody at that time was to, for that crime of killing or having 2 people shot, was to shoot Daly as the mutineer. Because we're going to play a small little bit of track from the interview that was made back in, I think it was the 70s, was it? 60s? 70s, of which some of the mutineers talk. But there's one particular man talks, McWeeny, and I am fully convinced, and no one will change my mind, that the man that pulled the trigger, there was shots fired by both officers as they came up the laneway up to the magazine, but nobody will convince me that the man that pulled the trigger that night that shot the 2 boys was McWeeny. And because McWeeny shot 2 men, one of them an innocent man making his way back from the wet canteen, somebody had to pay the penalty, and McWeeny wasn't going to pay it, or neither was the other officer if he was the man that did it, but I'm convinced that McWeeny did it. Daly had to die. Somebody had to die, and Daly was the man because they reckon Daly was the ringleader. But it must also be said in relation to the mutiny in Jalunder and the mutiny in Solent. The first thing that's lost in a battle or a war or a struggle is the truth. And when Keenan and Kelly went into that Hut 17, that fateful evening after they made their way up from Jalunder to tell Daly, what was going on, they mentioned his brother Michael was part of the mutiny down in Jalunder. Michael wasn't. Michael was gone. Because Hawes, Gogarty, Lally and James and Michael Daly were making their way to the guardroom that fateful morning to hand themselves in when they met Sergeant Morahan. And Sergeant Morahan turned them round and he said, "Look, lads, what you're doing is wrong. Go back. There's another way. We'll handle it when James comes." James was his brother, the RSM, out on the range. He said, "We'll handle it when he comes back." And the boys turned around and they went back. But whatever happened between them leaving Sergeant Morahan and making their way back to their billets, Michael Daly went into his billet, but the 3 boys turned around and went back. And that mutiny was over. That mutiny was practically over when James Daly found out, or was told, that there was a mutiny. And he was also told that, and Charlie beard this out for me, that the Irish regiments in the British Army were all mutinying, that they were all at it, which wasn't true either. There was only one company, C Company, were the only men that were actually taking part in the mutiny. So, I asked Charlie why did Daly pick up his bayonet and charge up the hill to the magazine that fateful evening. And he said it had to do with what went on in the canteen. And I could picture, I come from a very strong military background myself. My grandfather joined the army in 1897, and to this day we have somebody in the army on both sides of the water. The Brexit line, as we call it now. I can see my father, Mick Chapman, Paddy Gaffney, the Lord mercy on him, and Eddie Doherty and them sitting at the bar, and some young lad walking in saying that I'm after starting a mutiny, and they'd say, yeah, good man, fair play to you, you handed up your weapons, now what are you going to do with your mutiny? And I could see that that's the type of thing that would have gone on, that the old sweats would have picked on the young sweat and made them feel guilty. And Charlie reckoned that it was the old sweats were getting on to him. Daly was a bit of a hothead, and as I said, he bit the bullet, grabbed the bayonet and decided to prove them wrong. But it didn't work out that way. But I'd like to thank Mary for inviting me, making contact with me, and getting me involved in something like this, because it's something I believe in. I believe they should have been honoured years ago. I firmly believe they should never have gone through the life that they went through up to getting a few measly pounds for what they did. They were brave, they were honourable, and like a lot of people, they were thinking of their country, but the only difference was they did something about it. Thank you. Yeah, I will. Yeah.
Proved anything, didn't do anybody. They weren't even mentioned as playing a part. And they did play a part. They played a big part. They took a very big stand in a foreign country. And in the British Army, which was at that time supposed to be the enemy of Ireland. It was a failure for the men. It did no good to Ireland, as far as I could see it. It was a failure to the men because they had sacrificed everything for what? That's the big question mark all through the years. For what? Because nobody recognised them.
Daly's tombstone or headstone. When they did put it up, they got the date wrong. They put it up as October, not November.
Okay, thanks very much, Danny. I think a round of applause there for Danny. It's very informative. And technology is always difficult to work with. I don't know how the men found out about the news of what was happening at home. When you tell current generations, just think, well, could they not get a text or something like that? You know, but anyway. Listen, it's a delight now to welcome our last speaker of the evening. He's retired county councillor and chairperson of the Connaught Rangers Memorial Group. Can I ask Jerry Lundy to come up and say a few words, please? Thank you.
Donald, as chairman of the Connaught Rangers Memorial Committee, it is both an honour and a privilege to thank you all for attending this very important official launch for the centenary of the Connaught Rangers mutiny in India, which took place on June the 28th, 1920. I want to thank the Cathaoirleach of Sligo County Council, Councillor Tom McSharry, for his address, and all the elected members and politicians and members of the community for their attendance here in Chatline today. I'm sure you all enjoyed our excellent panel of speakers. Dr. Ewan O'Halpin, Dr. Mario Draper, Danny Tiernan, Roger McCarrick, President of the Chamber of Commerce in Tubbercurry, Brian Scanlon, Mary Henry and Councillor McSharry. And I want to thank them most sincerely for giving us their time, their expertise and knowledge at today's launch. Of course, this launch could not have taken place without the help, advice and guidance of County Librarian Donald Tinney of Sligo County Council and his excellent staff, Michelle Brennan and John Duggan. And on behalf of our committee, I want to thank them most sincerely for organising and promoting this official launch. So please give them a round of applause. Here also, I want to acknowledge the help of the Area Office of Sligo County Council and Area Engineer David Golden for his help with planning permission for the monument, and the support of the Chamber of Commerce here in Tubbercurry, the Old Fair Day Committee in Tubbercurry, the Tidy Towns Committee in Tubbercurry, and the elected members and staff of Tubbercurry Ballymote Municipal District for their support and encouragement for this commemoration project 2020. The proposed unveiling and dedication of the monument will be held in June 2020, the centenary of the Mutiny. And I can tell you at this stage that the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, has been invited to perform the formal dedication and keynote address. We are awaiting at this stage confirmation from Áras and Uachtaráin regarding dates, etc. Finally, I would like to thank the staff here in Chatliney for making the premises available, John Nyland and his staff, for this launch, and to Teresa Cawley and staff from the Cawley's Hotel in Tubbercurry for providing refreshments for today's launch. Please excuse me because I slipped up on one page here, and bear with me just for 2 more minutes. As you know, events like this launch today don't just happen overnight. And this is where I want to pay a special tribute to Mary and Brendan Henry for the long hours of hard work they have put into the entire event, from research, making contacts with all of our speakers, and sheer determination to have the memory of these great Sligo men recognised for their bravery and commitment to Ireland's fight for freedom and independence. Mary, as you all know, is the granddaughter of James Gorman from here in Tubbercurry, born right across the road from where we are. And it was Mary and Brendan's sheer determination and enthusiasm that got me on board as chairman of this committee to honour these great Sligo and Irish men, namely James Gorman, Jack Scanlon, Martin Conlon and Patrick Dyer, who have become Ireland's forgotten heroes. Well, not any longer will they be forgotten, as next June 2020 we will see the erection of a monument dedicated to these great Sligo men who took part in the mutiny in India. The monument will be erected on Wolftown Square here in the heart of Tubbercurry, and I think it is also significant that the monument will be in Wolftown Square, which is named after another great Irishman, Theobald Wolftown, one of the founding members of the United Irishmen and leader of the 1798 rebellion. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, as chairman of this committee, I want again thank you all sincerely for your patience and for your attention during all of our presentations here today. And we look forward to 2020 and when we have a beautiful monument in the square in Tubbercurry to recognise these great Irishmen. As you know, when you travel around the country, there's monuments to some of our great freedom fighters, like Michael Collins and Béal na Blá, Tom Barry in Kilmichael. There's so many of them, Countess Markovich in Sligo and in Dublin. So here in Tubbercurry now, we're going to have a monument to recognise the great men of the Connaught Rangers. Thank you very much indeed.
That draws things to conclusion here today, but I'd like to just mention as well Ava's assistance on the sound, Odilon as well, and James and his team from Studio Rover did the live streaming, and I've also been asked to mention James Daly's niece, Veronica Dunn, who I think is watching in Tullamore on Facebook as we speak. And I look forward to next June. I think if this is a flavour of what we're going to get, it's going to be fantastic. We will have a cultural event, hopefully, around the unveiling as well. So I look forward to coming to Tubbercurry again in June. And thank you, the audiences, both here and around the world. So thank you very much.